It took her 7 years to get away from that man. Then he sued her, demanding everything, her apartment, her savings, even the shares in her father's company. And on the first day of court, her lawyer fled. Reporters swarmed her like wolves, and he walked in with a victorious smile. Then, a convoy of black cars stopped. And it was all silence. Like and comment with the name of the city you're watching to let me know how far this story has progressed. Don't turn off the video, because what happens next will change everything. The rain started sometime around 4 in the morning and hadn't quit since. Camille Arden stood at the bathroom sink of her rented studio apartment on the 6th floor of a building that smelled like mildew and other people's cooking. And she stared at herself in the mirror with the kind of hollow stillness that comes after you've cried so many times you finally run out of the chemical capacity for it. Her eyes were dry, her face was thin in a way it hadn't been 2 years ago. The fluorescent light above her buzzed and flickered, a sound like something dying slowly. And outside the window, the city was a gray smear behind sheets of October rain. She had court in 4 hours. She had no lawyer. She turned the faucet on and let cold water run over her wrists and tried to make herself breathe at a normal rate. In through the nose, out through the mouth. The therapist she'd seen 6 months ago had told her that. The therapist she'd stopped seeing because Nathan's attorneys had somehow gotten access to her session notes and used 3 sentences out of context in a legal filing that described her as emotionally volatile and prone to paranoid ideation. The filing had been picked up by 3 news outlets within 48 hours. Nathan knew how to use every system. That was what she had never fully understood during their 7 years of marriage. She had told herself he was just ambitious, driven, demanding in the way successful men sometimes were. She had made the mistake that intelligent women sometimes make with men like Nathan Vale. She had confused precision with intelligence and control with competence. And she had spent 7 years quietly dismantling herself to fit the shape of the life he'd decided they should have. He'd corrected her laugh once, told her it was too loud for the dinner they were attending. She had laughed differently ever since. It had taken her 2 years after leaving him to notice she had stopped laughing entirely. She turned the faucet off and went back to the bedroom and sat on the edge of the mattress and looked at her phone. 11 missed calls from the number she had saved as Marcus Lowe attorney, her lawyer of 3 months. The man she had paid $12,000 she didn't have, scraped together from freelance editing work and a small advance from a literary journal she'd written for. $12,000 and 80 hours of documented evidence and 4 sworn depositions from former employees of Nathan's law firm who claimed they'd witnessed financial fraud. She called him back. He picked up on the second ring. Camille. His voice had the flat quality of a man who had rehearsed what he was about to say and still couldn't make himself believe it. Marcus, it's 4 in the morning and I have court in 4 hours. I know. I'm sorry. I can't. He stopped. She heard him exhale. I received a package at my home last night. At my home, Camille. My wife opened it before I could. It had photographs of my daughter. At her school. At her soccer practice. Just photographs. No note. No threat written anywhere. The studio apartment went completely quiet except for the flickering light. Marcus, I have 2 kids. I can't do this case. I'm withdrawing my appearance first thing this morning, and I'm refunding your retainer in full, and I am genuinely sorry, but I cannot sit across a courtroom from whatever Nathan Vale has behind him and go home to my family every night and not know. She didn't say anything. Camille, I'm sorry. I know, she said. She ended the call. She sat on the edge of the mattress for a long time. The rain hit the window in waves. She was 34 years old and she had a court appearance at 9 a.m. with no legal representation and a man who had spent the better part of 2 years systematically destroying every structure she had tried to build for herself waiting on the other side of a courtroom. Nathan would have 3 attorneys. He would have a prepared statement. He would have the kind of composed, telegenic confidence that made judges unconsciously defer to him before the proceedings even started. She got dressed in the dark because the overhead light in the bedroom had been broken since she moved in, and she kept forgetting to report it. Or maybe she didn't forget. Maybe she just hadn't found the bandwidth to care about one more small, broken thing in a life full of them. She wore the gray blazer and the black slacks, And the good shoes that Nathan had once told her made her look like she was trying too hard. She'd given them away the year they separated and then bought them back from a consignment shop 6 months later because she'd realized she liked them, and that small act of reclamation was one of the only things that had felt real to her in a long time. She took the subway at 5:30 because she needed the extra time and also because she couldn't afford a cab, and she sat in the near-empty car with her folder of documents across her knees and watched the tunnel lights strobe past the windows and tried to build something in her mind that resembled a plan. She had the documents. She had the evidence her lawyer had gathered. She had, technically, the right to represent herself in a preliminary civil hearing, though she knew what that looked like to a judge. She knew what Nathan would make it look like. Desperate, unstable. The narrative he had been carefully constructing in public for the past 4 months. Camille Arden, the emotionally troubled ex-wife, making unfounded fraud allegations against a respected attorney because she couldn't accept that the marriage had ended. He had written that narrative before she even knew a lawsuit was coming. She got out at Civic Center and walked the 6 blocks to the courthouse through rain that had gone sideways in the wind. By the time she reached the stone steps, she was wet at the shoulders, and her hair was flattened against her face, and 3 camera crews were already positioned outside, which meant Nathan had told someone she would be arriving alone, because that was the kind of detail he managed. The reporters saw her immediately. "Camille, do you have a statement about the fraud allegations?" "Camille, is it true your attorney withdrew this morning?" "Ms. Arden, sources close to Nathan Vale say you're planning to delay proceedings again." She kept her face fixed and kept walking and did not run because running was what they wanted, the image of her running, the caption that wrote itself. She made it to the bottom of the courthouse steps and stopped because there were more cameras at the top, and she was calculating the distance and her wet shoes on wet stone and whether she could get through the doors before Nathan arrived when she heard the sound. A convoy. Black SUVs, 3 of them, moving in from the north end of the boulevard with the kind of unhurried certainty that required either official clearance or the kind of reputation that made clearance unnecessary. They pulled to the curb in a line without urgency. The camera crews turned. The reporters stopped mid-sentence. The first 2 doors opened and men stepped out. Dark suits, no ties, faces that didn't arrange themselves into expressions unless there was a reason. They moved with the economy of people who had been trained to assess rooms before entering them. One of them said something into an earpiece. Another positioned himself at the base of the courthouse steps facing outward. Then the rear door of the middle vehicle opened. Camille had never seen Lucien Moretti in person before. She had seen his name in financial pages, always preceded by the words alleged or reportedly or according to sources familiar with. She had seen one photograph, taken at a distance at a city infrastructure fundraiser 3 years ago, in which he appeared as a tall, dark shape slightly removed from the people around him, like a figure in a painting who existed in a different layer of depth than everyone else. In person, he was different. He was somewhere north of 40, with a face that had been lived in rather than maintained, dark eyes that moved across the scene with the unhurried precision of someone doing math. He wore a charcoal coat that cost more than her monthly rent, and carried himself with the particular stillness of a man who had not been in a hurry in a very long time, because the world generally accommodated his pace. He looked directly at her. She didn't move. She wasn't sure she could. He crossed the distance between them without acknowledging anyone else. Not the cameras. Not the reporters who were now talking in urgent whispers into phones and mics. Not the 3 courthouse security guards who had appeared at the top of the steps and were watching with expressions torn between professional obligation and the good sense not to start anything. He stopped in front of her. He reached inside his coat and produced an umbrella. Black, simple, and opened it above her head with a motion so casual it might have been choreographed. "Sorry I'm late," he said. His voice was low and unhurried. There was a faint accent underneath it, not strong enough to place precisely. Something old, layered over years of American cities. Camille stared at him. "I don't know you," she said. "I know." He kept the umbrella steady above her. "Your father did." The cameras were going insane behind them. She could hear the reporters trying to recover their professional composure and failing, talking over each other with the barely contained hysteria of people who had just watched a story rewrite itself in real time. She heard Nathan's name mentioned twice, and then she heard a different sound, the particular silence of a man arriving and finding that the scene he'd prepared for no longer existed. She turned. Nathan Vale stood at the top of the courthouse steps. He was exactly as polished as he had always been, in the charcoal suit with the subtle pinstripe that he knew photographed well, flanked by two of his 3 attorneys and a junior paralegal carrying a leather briefcase. He had the composed, slightly mournful expression of a wronged man who had perfected the performance through months of media appearances. He had clearly been expecting to walk down those steps toward Camille isolated and rained on with cameras catching every second of her exposure. Instead, he was looking at Lucien Moretti. Something happened to Nathan's face. It didn't collapse. Nathan Vale's face never collapsed in public. He was too disciplined for that, had spent too many years in courtrooms managing juries with calibrated micro-expressions. But something behind his eyes went wrong, like a door slamming shut in a house where all the lights had just cut out. He knew who Lucien Moretti was. Everyone in this city who operated at the level Nathan operated at knew who Lucien Moretti was. The knowledge lived in different places for different people. For politicians, it lived in the memory of favors extended and collected. For judges, it lived somewhere lower and more visceral. For the men who ran certain shipping operations along the eastern seaboard, it lived in the spaces between contracts that were never written down. For Nathan, it lived in the face of a man he had built his entire legal career carefully, never crossing. Lucien did not acknowledge Nathan, did not look at him. This was, Camille would later understand, a specific kind of message. Acknowledgement would have implied equivalence, and Lucien Moretti had not arrived at this courthouse to imply anything. "We should go inside," Lucien said to Camille. "Rain's getting worse." "Why are you doing this?" she said. It wasn't a question exactly. It was the only coherent thing her brain could produce. "Lucien, say." Lucien glanced at her briefly. There was nothing warm in his expression, but nothing cold either. Something more difficult to categorize. The look of a man who has decided something after a long time and is now simply executing the decision. "Your father saved my sister's life," he said quietly. "I told him I'd repay the debt. He asked me to make sure powerful men couldn't bury you." A pause. "You were doing a reasonable job of avoiding that on your own until recently." She opened her mouth. "Not here," he said. "Inside." She walked up the steps beside Lucien Moretti while his security detail fell into position around them with the practiced smoothness of people doing this for the 100th time. The cameras screamed. The reporters were calling questions that blurred together into white noise. Nathan and his attorneys parted at the top of the steps without speaking, and she watched Nathan's jaw tighten as she passed within 3 feet of him without looking at him once. It was the first time in 3 years she had been within 20 feet of her ex-husband without feeling the constriction in her chest, the animal readiness to defend or appease or disappear. The first time she had walked past him and felt nothing except the slow return of something she couldn't immediately name, something like the memory of herself. The courthouse interior was marble and fluorescent light and the particular smell of institutional anxiety, coffee and carpet cleaner, and the low-grade stress of people navigating systems designed to be navigated by other people. Lucien's team moved through it with a disregard for its implicit architecture that she found almost surreal to watch. The security guards at the metal detectors stepped back. A woman in a clerk's uniform caught Lucien's eye and looked away quickly and found something important on her computer screen. They were directed to a side conference room before the hearing, and Lucien dismissed all but 2 of his men and sat down across from Camille at the table and looked at her with the unhurried directness of someone who was not going to perform pleasantries. "You know what he filed," he said. "I've read every document," she said. "Twice." "Then you know the fraud claim is fabricated." "Of course it's fabricated. He moved my inheritance into 3 shell companies over the course of 4 years, and then built a paper trail suggesting I authorized the transfers. I didn't authorize anything. I didn't even know those accounts existed until my father's estate attorney tried to close the probate and found the discrepancy." Lucien watched her as she spoke. There was something unsettling about the way he listened. Completely still, processing every word, giving back nothing reflexively, none of the unconscious performing of attention that people usually did. He just listened. "The attorney you had," he said, "withdrew this morning. They sent photographs of his daughter to his house. Nothing changed in Lucian's face, but something shifted slightly in his eyes. A temperature drop so subtle she almost missed it. I need you to understand something, he said. I'm going to handle the legal representation. I have attorneys, real ones, not people who can be frightened with photographs. They'll file an appearance by 8:30. The preliminary hearing will be postponed. That buys us time. And what does that cost me? She said. He looked at her steadily. Nothing. I don't believe that. You're not wrong to be skeptical. He folded his hands on the table. They were large hands with a scar across the back of the left one that hadn't been given to him by accident. I'm not a charity. I don't do things for free in the general sense. What I'm doing for you is a debt repayment, not a transaction. The difference matters. My father, she said. Yes. She sat back and looked at the ceiling and tried to organize the information into something she could functionally think about. Her father, Thomas Arden, had died 18 months ago. Quiet, bookish, devoted to literature and bad coffee, the kind of man who remembered everyone's birthday and kept a library card in 3 different branches and had once spent 6 months organizing a reading program for juvenile detention facilities out of what she'd believed was nothing more than an excess of conscience. He had never mentioned Lucien Moretti. He had never mentioned anything that might explain how a book publisher from Connecticut had come to be owed a debt by a man who was reportedly responsible for the smooth operation of half the organized crime infrastructure on the eastern seaboard. What did he do? She asked. For your sister. Lucien was quiet for a moment. Not the silence of someone deciding whether to tell her, she thought, more the silence of someone deciding how much of the truth she needed right now versus how much would take up space she needed for other things. There was a federal investigation, he said, several years ago. My organization was under significant pressure. My sister was 22 and in the wrong place at a time when being in the wrong place meant being used as leverage against me. He paused. Your father was working with a civic literacy program that operated out of the same building where she was being held temporarily by federal contractors who were operating well outside their brief. He found her. He didn't call the police because he understood that the police in this context were the problem, not the solution. He called the right people. She was out within 12 hours. Another pause. He never asked for anything. He told me his name and said to pass it on to anyone who might need books. Camille absorbed that. The image of her father saying that with complete seriousness, pass it on to anyone who might need books, was so precisely him that something ached in her chest. He would have hated this, she said. The cars? The suits? Probably, Lucien said. There was something in his voice that might, in a different person, have been affection. He came to see me once, 2 years before he died, told me you were in a marriage that was going wrong, asked me to keep an eye out without involving myself unless it became necessary. A beat. He was very clear about the without involving myself part. He didn't want you to know. Why are you telling me now? Because you're here alone in a courthouse with no attorney and a man upstairs who is trying to take apart the last things your father left you. His voice stayed level throughout this. The situation has become necessary. The conference room door opened and a lean man in his early 50s in a dark suit put his head in and looked at Lucien. We have 20 minutes, the man said. Lucien stood. He was taller than she'd registered outside, with the economy of movement of someone who had long ago made peace with the space he occupied. You don't have to trust me, he said to Camille. You just have to walk into that courtroom. I'll handle the rest. And Nathan, she said. What happens to Nathan? The lean man in the doorway had the practiced absence of expression that suggested he was very good at not having heard things. Lucien looked at Camille, and something in his face shifted for a fraction of a second. Not toward warmth exactly, but toward something that acknowledged her as a person rather than a problem to be solved. Nathan made this public, he said, so we'll handle it publicly, through the courts, through every legal mechanism available. He paused. To start with. She understood what the pause meant. She told herself she should be afraid of it. She was not quite afraid of it. And that fact, the fact of her own absence of fear, standing in a courthouse conference room with a man whose name made federal prosecutors develop stress-related insomnia, told her something about how thoroughly the last 7 years had rearranged her internal architecture. She stood up and straightened her blazer. The good shoes. The ones she'd bought back. She picked up her folder of documents because she had prepared them, and she was damned if she was going to walk into that courtroom empty-handed, regardless of who was flanking her. "All right," she said. The courtroom was already filling when they entered. She registered the moment the room shifted. It was physical, almost, like a change in air pressure. The attorneys at the far table going still, the bailiff doing a slow look from the doors to the judge's empty bench and back, the court reporter pausing with her fingers above the keys. 3 journalists in the public gallery simultaneously raised their phones before a security officer moved toward them. Nathan was already seated at his table. He had composed himself since the steps. He was doing the thing he did in courtrooms, the steady breathing, the cultivated stillness, the way he looked at documents without reading them while visibly appearing to read them, constructing for any observer the image of a man utterly in command of the proceeding. He was very good at it. He had been doing it since law school. He looked up when the door opened. He looked at Lucienne, and Camille watched Nathan Vale, the man who had spent 7 years making her feel small and unstable and perpetually insufficient, press his lips together and look back down at his documents with hands that were not quite as steady as they had been. She sat down at the plaintiff's table. Lucienne settled beside her with the composure of a man attending a meeting he had personally scheduled. The lean attorney was already unfolding documents. A second attorney, a woman in her late 30s with reading glasses pushed up into dark hair, was speaking quietly into her phone and making notes. The bailiff announced the judge. The Honorable Patricia Morrow entered and took her seat and surveyed the courtroom with the expression of someone who had been on the bench for 20 years and was no longer capable of being surprised by anything. She looked at Lucien's attorneys. She looked at Lucienne. Something passed across her face too quickly to read. "Counsel," she said to the lean attorney, "you're filing appearance today?" "Filed at 8:47, Your Honor. We're requesting a 60-day extension to complete discovery. We also have a motion to compel that we'll be filing by end of business regarding certain financial records that appear to have been omitted from the defendant's disclosures." Nathan's lead attorney, Gerald Pruitt, stood up. Pruitt was 60, expensive, and had the faintly aggrieved bearing of a man who believed that legal proceedings should unfold according to his preferred timeline. "Your Honor, we object to any extension. This case has already seen one delay attributable to the plaintiff's failure to maintain adequate counsel. The plaintiff's prior counsel withdrew under circumstances we intend to address separately," the lean attorney said without inflection. "We can provide documentation if the court requires." Something moved in Pruitt's expression. The smallest contraction, the involuntary recognition of a trap whose dimensions he was only beginning to perceive. Judge Morrow looked between the 2 tables. Then she looked at the motion to compel, which her clerk had just placed before her. "Extension granted," she said. 60 days. "Mr. Pruitt, I'll review the motion to compel tonight. If the financial omissions are what they appear to be, we'll be scheduling a sanctions hearing." She looked at Pruitt over her reading glasses. "Your client may want to use the 60 days productively." Pruitt sat down. Nathan did not move, did not turn, did not look at Lucienne. He stared at the table with the perfect composure of a man who was very carefully not reacting, and Camille knew that expression, had lived with it for 7 years, knew it was the expression Nathan wore when he was calculating the distance between where he was and where he needed to get to, planning 3 moves ahead while appearing to feel nothing. She also knew, for the first time since the lawsuit had begun, that he was afraid. She didn't feel satisfied by it, didn't feel the vindictive rush she'd expected and perhaps earned after everything he'd put her through. What she felt instead was something quieter and stranger, a kind of grieving for the years she'd spent being afraid of a man who was stripped of all his systems and instruments of control, just a person who panicked in the dark like everyone else. The preliminary matters took another 40 minutes. Motions, dates, procedural filings, the flat procedural language of the legal system doing its grinding institutional work. Through it all, Lucienne sat beside her and didn't speak except once, very quietly, when she reached for her water glass and her hand was shaking enough to notice. He didn't say anything. He simply put his hand briefly on the table near hers, not touching, just present, and she steadied. When the hearing concluded and they filed out, Nathan left quickly through a side exit with his attorneys in a knot around him. She caught one last look at his profile, the precise jaw, the expensive haircut, the set of a mouth that had once told her she was the most important thing in his life. And then he was through the door and gone. Outside, the rain had thinned to mist. Lucien's cars were still at the curb. The reporters had not left. But something had shifted in how they stood. The hunger was still there, but it was confused now, trying to locate itself in a story that no longer fit the shape it had arrived with. Lucien stopped on the steps and turned to her. "My people will drive you home. I can take the subway." "I know you can." He didn't argue further, just looked at her with that same assessing directness. "We need to meet tomorrow. There are things about the financial trail I need to walk you through, things that go beyond the lawsuit." She looked at him. Mist collecting in her hair, good shoes on wet stone, folder of documents pressed against her chest. "Things my father knew about?" Something shifted at the edges of Lucien's expression, not quite a flinch, more like the acknowledgement of a question that had a complicated answer. "Some of them," he said. She stood there and thought about the 7 years she'd spent making herself smaller inside a life that had never been designed to contain her. She thought about Marcus Lowe's daughter at soccer practice and the photographs someone had sent to his house. She thought about her father, quiet and bookish in his study on Sunday mornings, reading correspondence she'd never been allowed to see. She thought about what Lucien had not said when she asked what would happen to Nathan. The lean attorney appeared at Lucien's shoulder. "Car's ready?" Camille looked at Lucien for another moment. "Tomorrow," she said. "Fine." She walked toward the car and a reporter called her name and she did not run. She did not look back. She got into the back seat of the black SUV and the door closed behind her and the city moved past the tinted windows and gray wet streaks, and she held her folder of documents and breathed in and out at a normal rate and tried to understand why. For the first time in a very long time, the breath came easily. Behind her, through the rear window, she could see Lucien still on the courthouse steps. He stood with his hands in his coat pockets, watching the car pull away as the cameras crowded around him and he paid them no attention at all, looking only at the direction she had gone. She turned back to face forward. She did not yet know what Lucien Moretti was fully capable of, did not know the full architecture of the debt her father had set in motion years ago in a building she'd never visited, or what the words some of them meant when a man like Lucien qualified an answer. Did not know what Nathan was planning in the side room he'd disappeared into with his attorneys. What call he was making right now? What machinery he was about to set in motion? She would find out. Tomorrow had the flavor of a door about to open into a room she hadn't seen yet. And for the first time, instead of dread, she felt something closer to readiness, sharp and cold and honest, as the car turned north and carried her away from the courthouse and into whatever was coming next. The car dropped her at her building at 11:14 in the morning. She knew the time because she checked her phone 3 times during the ride and retained nothing from it except the numbers on the clock, her brain doing the thing it did under stress, where it logged irrelevant data precisely and let everything important slide past like water off glass. 11:14. She was supposed to have been in that courtroom until at least 2. She had prepared for a full day of procedural war, and instead she was standing in the lobby of her building with her folder of documents and wet shoes and a mind that couldn't locate its own edges. The super's door was open. He saw her and started to say something about the hallway light on 4 that had been out for a week, and she said yes. "I know. I'll put in the request," and kept moving to the elevator. In her apartment, she stood in the center of the main room for a moment without taking off her coat. The apartment was small, and she had made it functional, but not much beyond that. A desk, a second-hand couch, boxes of her father's books that she hadn't finished sorting, a plant on the window ledge that was alive only through some biological stubbornness she admired and couldn't explain. She had a photograph of her father on the desk, him in his office at the publishing house, mid-sentence about something, hands moving, the particular animation that came into his face when he was talking about a manuscript he believed in. She looked at it for a long time. Then she sat down at the desk and opened her laptop and typed Lucien Moretti into a search bar she had never used for that name before, because for the previous 6 months she'd had a lawyer to insulate her from whatever was on the other side of that search, and now she didn't. What came back was voluminous and largely useless. Financial press releases about infrastructure investments and a shipping logistics company incorporated in Delaware, and a real estate development arm that had built 3 mixed-use towers in the city over the past decade. A profile from 7 years ago in a business magazine that described him as reclusive and data-driven and intensely private, accompanied by the single distant photograph she had seen before. References in investigative journalism pieces that were careful to the point of paralysis, alleged, reportedly, sources familiar with his operations, individuals who declined to be identified. The particular grammar of reporters writing about men they couldn't fully see but couldn't stop watching. One piece, from a legal affairs journal, noted that over the previous decade, the federal government had opened 4 separate investigations into enterprises connected to Lucien Moretti. All 4 had been closed. The journalist's tone was careful and bewildered in equal measure. She closed the laptop. Her father's books were in 4 boxes stacked against the far wall. She had brought them from the house in Connecticut after probate closed, not knowing what to do with them, not yet able to sort them because sorting them meant making decisions about what to keep and what to give away, and both options felt like a form of abandonment. The boxes had been in her apartment for 5 months. She looked at them across the room and thought about a 22-year-old woman in a building somewhere in this city, and her father making a phone call she had never known about. He had never told her. She wasn't sure if she was angry about that. She held the feeling up and examined it from different angles, and found it was less anger than something more complicated. A retroactive realization that the version of her father she had known had been a partial one, the version he presented in rooms where she was present, and that the actual full person had contained rooms she had never been let into. That was probably true of everyone's parents. It was still strange to sit with. Her phone rang at 2 in the afternoon. Unknown number. She almost didn't answer and then thought about the past 24 hours and answered. Ms. Arden, a woman's voice, measured, professional, carrying just enough warmth to signal it was deliberate. My name is Vera Sloan. I'm one of Mr. Moretti's attorneys. We met briefly this morning. I wanted to confirm the meeting tomorrow and give you an address. Camille wrote down the address, a building in the financial district she recognized by name, one of the towers she'd seen in the search results. Is there anything you need me to bring? She asked. Whatever documentation you have related to your father's estate, the probate records, the correspondence with the estate attorney who found the discrepancy, anything relating to the shell companies. A brief pause. And Ms. Arden, I'd recommend not discussing the details of today's hearing with anyone outside this circle until we've had a chance to talk tomorrow. I don't have anyone to discuss them with, Camille said. Another brief pause, this one carrying a different quality. All right, Vera said. 10 o'clock. We'll see you then. After she hung up, Camille sat with the phone in her hand and thought about the phrase "this circle," the casual, possessive way it had been delivered, the circle already defined and her already placed within it, and how she had not objected, and what that meant about where she already was. She ate something she didn't taste and went to bed at 9 and lay awake until past 1 listening to the rain that had started again and trying to organize the architecture of the thing she had walked into. She slept eventually. Her dreams were procedural and exhausting, rooms full of documents she couldn't read. The next morning was cold and clear, the rain having pushed through overnight and left the city washed and bright and hard-edged in the October light. She dressed carefully, took the subway to the financial district and walked 2 blocks to the address Vera had given her. The building was glass and steel and 40 floors of considered anonymity, the kind of architecture that announces nothing because the people inside it don't need to announce anything. The lobby had the hushed quality of expensive places that want you to understand your volume before you enter. A woman at the reception desk knew her name before she said it and directed her to the 11th floor. The conference room had floor-to-ceiling windows facing south toward the harbor. Vera Sloan was already there, early 50s, dark hair with gray running through it in a way that suggested she'd stopped managing it some years ago and never looked back. She had the reading glasses pushed up into her hair from the previous day, and a coffee in front of her, and a tablet and several organized stacks of paper that had been assembled by someone very precise. The lean attorney from the courthouse, whose name she now knew was Daniel Rice, was on the phone in the corner. He finished the call and sat down and opened a laptop without preamble. Lucien arrived 4 minutes after Camille. She noticed the 4 minutes because she had been watching the door, and she noticed noticing it, and then she had to decide what to do with that information about herself. He came in with the same unhurried quality as before, in a dark suit without the overcoat, and there was a woman with him she hadn't seen before, younger, maybe 30, who moved with the focused purpose of someone whose job was to be in the room without being in the room, and set a tablet on the table near Lucien's chair and disappeared to a seat along the wall. Lucien looked at Camille when he sat down. "You slept," he said. It wasn't a question. "Badly," she said. "That's better than not at all." He turned to Vera. "The veil filings." What followed was 2 hours that felt like surgery with the anesthesia turned too low, precise, necessary, quietly horrifying. Vera and Daniel laid out what 3 weeks of intensive financial forensics had uncovered. The shell companies, 3 incorporated in Nevada, 1 in Delaware, had been established over a period of 4 years, beginning 14 months before Thomas Arden's death. The transfers from the estate's pre-distribution accounts had been authorized through a power of attorney document that bore Camille's signature and a notary stamp from a notary in Hartford who, when contacted, had no record of the transaction. "He forged my signature," Camille said. "He had your signature forged," Daniel corrected. "The document itself was prepared by a third party. We have a strong probability of identifying them. There are formatting patterns in the notary block that are consistent with a document preparation service Nathan's firm used for offshore transactions between 2018 and 2021. "How much did he take?" Vera turned one of the stacks of paper toward her. "From your father's estate, approximately $900,000 across 4 transfers. Additionally, the publishing company shares your father intended to leave you. They were reclassified 18 months before his death through an amendment to his estate plan. The amendment appears to have been prepared by a law firm your father did not use, and that has no record of representing him." The room was quiet for a moment. Outside the windows, the harbor was flat and silver under the October sky. "He did this while my father was dying," Camille said. Nobody said anything to that. "My father was sick for 14 months before he died. Nathan knew. He was still my husband for most of that time." She looked at the papers on the table, her father's money, her father's company, the things he had built and saved and intended for her, rerouted while the man who'd done it sat at dinner tables with her and helped carry her father's hospice prescriptions in from the car. "He was helping carry the prescriptions in from the car," she said, out loud, to no one specifically. Lucien was watching her. He didn't offer condolences or context or the reflexive social medication of sympathy. He just watched, with an attention that had weight. "The lawsuit," she said after a moment, pulling herself back through will, "the fraud allegations he filed against me. He's trying to get ahead of this. If he can establish me as fraudulent and unstable before any of this becomes public, he controls the narrative," Vera said. "Yes. He's been building it for 8 months. The media placements, the quotes from unnamed sources, the timing of the filing, it was all designed to preempt." "Then we preempt him," Camille said. Daniel and Vera exchanged a brief look. Lucien did not. "There are complications," Lucien said. She waited. 3 of the transfers were routed through accounts connected to a logistics company in which I have a partial stake. His voice was level. "It appears Nathan was aware of this. The routing was deliberate. It creates the appearance of a financial connection between your father's estate and my operations. If that surfaces in the wrong context, it stops being a civil matter and becomes something else." The clarity arrived cold and complete. "He wasn't just hiding the money," she said. "He was setting up a future leverage point against you." "That's one interpretation. Is there another?" Lucien looked at her. "Not one I find convincing." She sat back in her chair and looked at the harbor through the windows and tried to understand the full dimensions of what Nathan had done. He had stolen from her father's dying months. He had forged her name. He had structured it so that if it ever came unraveled, it would pull someone far more dangerous than a corporate attorney into the blast radius, guaranteeing that any serious investigation would become complicated enough to bury itself. He had built a machine designed to function whether he won or lost. "He knew you'd get involved eventually," she said. "Somehow he knew there was a connection." "He's been investigating me for 2 years, Lucien said. Discreetly. He used a private intelligence firm. former federal contractors. They were good. They found the connection to your father. And then he planned around it. Nathan Vale is a very intelligent man, Lucian said. There was nothing admiring in his tone. It was the flat acknowledgement of a predator assessing another predator's range. He anticipated that your father's debt would activate at some point. He built in insurance. So coming here, Camille said slowly, coming to that courthouse, that wasn't just him losing a tactical advantage. That was me declaring myself, Lucian said, which I chose to do knowing what it might cost. Because I made your father a promise, and because Nathan had crossed from harassment into something that requires a different kind of response. He paused. I want you to understand that you did not cause this. The chain of decisions that led here started long before you walked out of that marriage. She looked at him. I'm not looking for absolution. I know, I wasn't offering it. The meeting continued for another hour. Action items, legal strategies, the procedural chess of the 60-day extension, and what evidence could be surfaced and in what order and through what channels to maximize damage to Nathan's position while minimizing exposure of the logistics company connection. Camille listened and asked questions, and Vera answered most of them with the brisk efficiency of someone who liked problems that had solutions. At the end, as Vera and Daniel gathered their documents, Lucien stayed seated. How much did he control? Lucien asked. Just that. The financial district outside, the cold harbor light, the particular quality of silence in a room where everyone else had just left. She thought about how to answer it. Everything, she finally said. And he did it so gradually, I didn't notice for years. He didn't take things away suddenly. He just redefined them. What I wanted, what I needed, what was reasonable. He was so precise about it. He never screamed, never hit me. She paused. People kept asking if he hit me, and when I said no, they stopped asking, like the word abuse required a bruise to be real. Lucien looked at her steadily. It's real, he said. I know that now. You knew it then. You just couldn't locate the evidence fast enough to trust yourself. She didn't answer that immediately because it was more precisely right than most things people had said to her in 3 years of processing, and precision sometimes required a moment to absorb. You're not what I expected, she said. What did you expect? Someone who needed me to be grateful. Something moved in his expression, fractional. I have enough people who are grateful to me, he said. It's not a quality I find particularly interesting. She left the building at 12:30 and ate lunch alone at a counter in a place near the subway entrance and looked at the street through the window and tried to inventory the state of her own interior. What she found there was not the brittle, exhausted fear she had been carrying for months, not the anticipatory flinch, something different, something with more traction, more weight, the quality of a person who has finally seen the full map of the battlefield and understands for the first time that the territory was never as vast as the enemy needed her to believe. The next 3 weeks moved in a kind of compressed intensity she would later struggle to recall in sequence. Vera's team filed the motion to compel and 2 supplementary motions. Nathan's attorneys filed counter motions. The financial forensics began producing results that Nathan's legal team was not equipped to suppress because they had not known how deep the forensics would go. A former paralegal at Nathan's firm, a woman named Rosa Gutierrez, who had left the firm abruptly 14 months earlier, agreed to speak with Vera after her 3rd week of consideration. What she described was a pattern of systematic financial manipulation reaching back 6 years, a law firm used as a private instrument for client fraud, shell companies, forged documents, offshore routing. Rosa Gutierrez had been afraid to speak for 14 months. Camille met her once in Vera's office, a woman in her mid-30s with careful eyes and a habit of watching the door. They sat across from each other, and Camille said simply, "Thank you." Rosa looked at her for a moment and said, "He told me if I ever talked, he'd make sure I couldn't work in this city again. I believed him for a long time." She paused. "I still believe him a little." "I know that feeling," Camille said. Lucien's name appeared in a newspaper item 12 days after the courthouse appearance, a gossip column that described him attending a preliminary court hearing and speculated about his relationship to Camille Arden. The item was 3 paragraphs, mostly question marks. and was careful to use the word allegedly 4 times in a space that only warranted it twice. Nathan's people had fed it. The framing was calculated to suggest Camille had traded one controlling relationship for another, more dangerous one. She read it at 7 in the morning with coffee she had actually tasted for once and felt the familiar contraction in her chest, and then, deliberately, let it go. She called Lucien. "I saw it," he said before she could speak. "It's going to escalate." "Yes." "He's trying to make me look like I'm under your control, like this is just one powerful man versus another and I'm a prop in the middle. I know what he's doing." "Then what do we do about it?" A brief pause. "You do what you've been doing. You keep showing up. You testify when the time comes. You speak with your own voice, in your own name." Another pause. "I'm a complication in this story. I know that, but I'm not the story." She held the phone and thought about that for a moment. "Are you always this direct?" "I find it saves time. Most people in your position wrap everything in 10 layers of misdirection. I'm not most people in my position." There was something dry and self-aware in it that surprised her. "And you've spent 7 years with a man who used misdirection as an art form. I'd rather you have something to work with." 3 days after that, she got a call from Gerald Pruitt. She almost didn't take it. She let it ring twice and then answered because not answering felt like fear, and she was done making decisions based on fear. "Ms. Arden," Pruitt's voice had lost some of its courtroom composure. Not much, but enough to be a signal. "I'm calling in a professional capacity on behalf of my client. Mr. Vale has asked me to convey that he's open to a resolution, a negotiated settlement that would address the financial claims on both sides, retract the public statements." "No," she said. Silence. "The answer is no," she said. "Not to any version of a settlement that involves dropping the investigation or retracting my account of what he did. Tell him that." "Ms. Arden, I'd encourage you to consider carefully." "I have considered. Tell him." She ended the call and sat with the phone in her hand and waited to feel something. Triumph, anxiety, the old reflexive guilt at having disappointed someone's expectations. What she felt instead was something closer to clarity, a line drawn. She called Vera and relayed the conversation. Vera said good and typed something, and the conversation moved on. 4 days before the charity gala at the Grand Meridian Hotel, at which Lucien had been asked to speak on behalf of a civic infrastructure initiative he had partially funded, Nathan made a move that nobody saw coming. He went to the press himself, not through intermediaries, not through unnamed sources. He called a press conference at his office and stood in front of cameras and gave a statement in which he expressed deep sadness at the deterioration of his former wife's mental health, his concern for her safety given her apparent entanglement with what he carefully described as organized crime figures, and his intention to file an emergency petition to have the civil proceedings expedited on grounds of ongoing harm. He was composed and mournful and completely convincing. Camille watched it on her laptop in the studio apartment while the afternoon light went flat and orange behind the window and the plant on the ledge cast a long shadow across the floor. She watched Nathan's face as he delivered the statement, the practiced grief, the measured pauses, the way he looked directly at the cameras, as if addressing not the journalists but the audience he knew would see it. And she felt a kind of cold, lucid fury that was entirely different from the panic he'd been trying to produce in her. She called Lucien. He picked up on the first ring. "You saw it," she said. "Yes. He's going to file the emergency petition. He's trying to compress the timeline before Vera's evidence is fully organized. He knows if the motion to compel gets ruled on before he moves, the financial documents become admissible, and he's finished." "Correct. So we need to accelerate." "Vera is already moving on it." A pause. "The gala is in 4 days. I'm still planning to speak. Nathan will likely have people there. I want you to attend." She said nothing for a moment. The orange light was going gray now, the apartment sliding into early dark. "He'll use it," she said. "He'll photograph us together and add it to the narrative." "Let him," Lucien said. "His narrative requires you to be invisible. You showing up, standing in a room full of this city's financial and political establishment and not disappearing. That's its own answer." She looked at the boxes of her father's books against the wall. "All right," she said. The gala was on a Thursday evening, and she wore a dress she had borrowed from a woman named Claire she'd met through her volunteer work. A dark green thing that fit her properly and didn't feel like armor and didn't feel like costume either. Just a dress. She took a car that Vera had arranged and arrived to the Grand Meridian to find the lobby already thick with the particular density of powerful people in formal clothes, the ambient noise pitched at the register of well-funded confidence. She was seated at a table with 3 of Lucien's business associates, not his criminal world, or at least not obviously, men and women in infrastructure and city planning and finance, who talked to her about her father's publishing work and the foundation she was building from his estate. She found herself talking back with more ease than she'd expected, answering questions, laughing once at something a woman in city planning said. A real laugh, the loud one Nathan had corrected years ago. And nobody flinched, nobody looked at her sideways. The laugh went into the room and dissolved naturally, and she filed that away. Lucien spoke at 8:30 from the podium at the front of the ballroom. She watched him from her table. He was a different kind of performer than Nathan. Where Nathan used warmth and relatability as instruments, Lucien used brevity and precision, sentences that didn't contain a single unnecessary word, an authority that didn't ask permission from the room. People listened to Nathan because he made them feel included. People listened to Lucien because something in the hindbrain recognized that this was not a voice to miss. She was watching him from across the ballroom when she felt the hand on her arm. She turned. Nathan was standing in the gap between tables, in a different suit than the press conference, composed and close, inside the perimeter she had spent 3 years unconsciously maintaining around herself. He had come in through a side entrance. Nobody had seen him enter. Or at least nobody had stopped him. "Camille," he said, low, private. The voice he used when he wanted her to understand that what was happening was between them and nothing to do with the room they were standing in. She did not step back. She was aware of making that choice, of the effort it required, of the fact that a year ago she would have stepped back automatically. "You need to leave," she said. "I just want to talk." "We talk through lawyers." "Camille." He shifted slightly, blocking the sightline from the main tables. His hand was still on her arm, not gripping, not yet, but there. "Look at what you're doing. Look at who you're doing it with. You left me because you said I was controlling, and you walked straight into this." He gestured the smallest gesture, meaning the room, meaning Lucien, meaning the entire architecture she'd been handed. "At least I tried to make you into someone. He'll just make you into a liability." She looked at him, at the face she had once woken up next to every morning for 7 years, and found first beautiful and then frightening and finally just exhausting. She looked at him and felt no love and no fear and very little anger anymore, just a clear, cold recognition. "You forged my signature," she said quietly. "While my father was dying, you took his money and his company and you built a paper trail to hide it. And you've spent 8 months trying to make me look like I'm losing my mind so no one would believe me when I said so." Nathan's jaw tightened. The composed grief from the press conference was gone. What was under it was older and harder. "You don't know what you're involved in," he said. "I know exactly what I'm involved in." "He will destroy you," Nathan said, and there was something in it now that wasn't performance, something genuine, though she couldn't tell if it was concern or the frustration of a man losing his grip on a thing he believed he owned. Not because he wants to, because that's what his world does to people who don't belong in it. You'll be collateral damage in something you can't even see the edges of. "Get your hand off my arm," she said. He did, not because she asked, but because someone appeared at her peripheral, one of Lucien's security, a broad-shouldered man in a dark suit who had materialized from somewhere and was now standing 3 feet away looking at Nathan with the focused patience of a man who had done this before and found it uncomplicated. Nathan looked at the security man and then looked back at Camille. "This isn't over," he said. "I know," she said, "but it will be." He left through the same side route he'd arrived by, and she watched him go and then turned back to face the ballroom and took a breath that came out steadier than she expected. The security man had already stepped back to his position. Lucien was still at the podium, mid-sentence, showing no sign of having seen anything. But when he finished speaking 20 minutes later and crossed the ballroom floor toward her table, he looked at her for a moment before sitting down and she saw in his face the specific kind of stillness that in a different person might have been barely contained anger, and in Lucien was something more controlled than anger, and therefore more dangerous. "He was here," Lucien said. Not a question. "He talked to me." "What did he say?" "The usual." She picked up her water glass. "That you'd destroy me." Lucien looked across the ballroom. Nathan was gone. The room moved around them, conversations and laughter and the clink of glasses, entirely indifferent. "Did he touch you?" Lucien said. "He put his hand on my arm." She set the glass down. "I handled it." "I know you did." He said it without qualification, and she believed him, and then she noticed she believed him and filed that away too alongside the laugh that the room had absorbed without flinching. The dinner continued. The conversation moved. An hour later, Camille excused herself to use the restroom and was crossing the secondary corridor on the mezzanine level when the sound reached her, high and sharp and wrong, cutting through the ambient noise of the gala below like a blade through cloth. A gunshot. Then two more in rapid sequence. Then the ballroom below erupted. The screaming started a half-second behind the shots, the crowd's collective voice hitting a register that had nothing civilized in it, pure animal response to sudden violence. She heard glass breaking. She heard the thunder of people moving at once away from something. She stood in the corridor and did not run. She stood very still, which was either composure or shock or some alchemy of both, and listened to the building reorient itself around catastrophe, and thought, with a clarity that arrived cold and complete. Nathan had done this. And she thought, Lucien was in that room. She was already moving back toward the stairs when the security man appeared again. Not the same one from before, a different one, and he was moving fast and his face had changed from professional patience into something operational and sharp. And he looked at her and said, "Ms. Arden, I need you to come with me right now." And she went. They came down a service corridor and through a kitchen entrance and into the ballroom from the east side, and she registered the scene in fragments. Tables overturned, people still crouched or moving in low panic clusters toward the exits, security personnel moving against the crowd in the opposite direction, and somewhere in the middle of it all, Lucien, standing, not crouched, not running, not doing what every sane instinct demanded, standing near the center of the room with his head up, scanning, while two of his men flanked him and a third was speaking urgently into an earpiece. There was a hole in the ballroom's north window the size of a dinner plate. The glass around it starred and collapsed, cold air pouring in through the gap. She crossed the room toward him, and he turned before she reached him, turned as if he'd heard something, though the noise was enormous, and looked at her with an expression she hadn't seen on his face before. Not relief exactly, something more visceral than relief. The expression of a person confirming the continued existence of something that matters. "You're all right," he said. "I'm all right." She looked at the window. "That was meant for you." "Probably." "Who?" He looked at her for a moment. The room was clearing around them, sirens already audible from outside. Lucien's people moving with the precision of a rehearsed response. His jaw was set, and his eyes were the temperature she had seen briefly in the conference room when she'd mentioned the photograph sent to Marcus Lowe's house, and she understood now what that temperature meant. "I have some ideas," Lucien said. "Nathan financed this," she said. He looked at her with the directness she had come to recognize as the thing he did instead of lying. He said nothing. "Tell me I'm wrong," she said. He didn't. The sirens were getting louder and people were still moving around them, and somewhere behind her a woman was crying. And Camille stood in the wreckage of a gala that had been designed to be a show of normalcy and looked at Lucien Moretti standing in the center of it, unhurried despite the chaos. The sirens came in through the broken window like something that had been waiting outside for permission. Camille stood in the wreckage of the ballroom and watched Lucien's face and understood that, whatever he was calculating behind those dark, still eyes, he had been calculating versions of it for years. The architecture of response, the ordering of consequences, the particular mathematics of a man who had built his entire operational life on the principle that reaction without information was just expensive noise. He wasn't reacting. He was listening to something she couldn't hear. One of his men came close and spoke quietly near his ear. Lucien nodded once. The man moved away. We need to leave, Lucian said to her. The police will take statements tomorrow. Right now, this building is a scene, and scenes attract complications. He looked at her steadily. Unless you want to spend the next 4 hours explaining our presence here to detectives who will file a report that Nathan's attorneys will access within 24 hours. She understood the logic. She didn't love it. Those two things could coexist. They left through the kitchen service exit and into a loading corridor and out to a side street where two of the black SUVs were already waiting with engines running. She got in the back of the first one. Lucian got in beside her. The door closed and the city moved past the windows, and neither of them spoke for 2 blocks. 3 shots, she said. 2 from the north building, 1 from the parking structure. He was looking out the window, not at her. Professional spacing, they weren't panicking. But they missed. They missed the first shot. A pause. The second and third were adjustments. Someone moved a table at the right moment. Random. Luck. Another pause, the quality of which she couldn't quite read. Not a word I typically rely on. You could have been killed. He turned and looked at her then, and something in his expression was difficult. Not the directness she'd come to expect from him, but something more compressed, more internal. The look of a man who had just processed a near miss and was deciding what to do with the information that it had mattered to him in a way he hadn't fully anticipated. Yes, he said. Just that. The car took her back to her apartment, and a security man she hadn't seen before was already positioned in the lobby when she arrived, which meant Lucien had arranged it before they left the building, which meant he'd been thinking about her safety before his own, and she stood in the elevator going up and held that fact carefully and didn't let herself do too much with it yet. She didn't sleep. At 6 a.m, Vera called. The police want a statement, Vera said. I've arranged for a detective to come to my office at noon. Don't speak to anyone else before then. Not reporters. Not anyone Nathan's people might have access to. A brief pause. How are you? I'm fine. Camille. I'm functioning. That's what I have right now. That's enough, Vera said, and hung up. The noon meeting was in Vera's office, a different building from Lucien's, smaller and more deliberately ordinary, the offices of a woman who wanted to be taken seriously in courtrooms rather than feared in corridors. The detective was a woman named Sandra Okafor, mid-40s, with the specific kind of tired that accumulated over a career of arriving after things had already happened. She asked questions methodically and wrote down answers, and her face gave nothing away, which Camille found oddly comforting after months of reading the faces of people deciding how much of their reaction to let her see. Camille told her what she had seen. She did not mention Nathan specifically as a suspect because Vera had been precise about that. Let the evidence do that work, not the statement. Don't give Pruitt a harassment angle to work with. After Okafor left, Vera closed the door and sat down across from Camille with the expression of someone who has news that requires a particular kind of delivery. Talk to me, Camille said. Daniel found something this morning. Vera folded her hands on the table. In the financial forensics, one of the shell companies, the Delaware Incorporation, has a secondary signatory on the account. Not Nathan. Someone else. Camille waited. The secondary signatory is a man named Paul Dreyer. He's a former federal contractor who worked for a private intelligence firm called Meridian Consulting Group. Vera paused. Meridian is the firm Nathan used to investigate Lucien's connection to your father. Camille was very still. Dreyer wasn't just doing opposition research, Vera continued. The account activity shows payments to Dreyer's personal holding company that predate the investigation by 18 months. He wasn't hired to find the Moretti connection. He was hired to build something that could be used as leverage against Moretti if needed. Vera looked at her. Nathan didn't discover the connection between your father and Lucien. He manufactured the appearance of one. The Delaware company was structured specifically to route money through an account that shared a correspondent bank with one of Moretti's logistics operations. It looks connected because Nathan built it to look connected. The office was quiet. Outside the window, the city made its ordinary noise. He framed it, Camille said. Partially. Your father's money was still stolen. That part is real and documentable. But the apparent link to Moretti's operations was constructed. It's designed to make any federal investigation into the stolen funds look like an investigation into organized crime, which triggers different jurisdictional protocols, different evidentiary standards, and, more importantly, gives Nathan the ability to approach certain federal contacts and suggests that pursuing your civil case would interfere with a larger ongoing matter. Camille pressed her fingers flat against the table and looked at them. He's been playing this for years. At least 3. He built a legal weapon inside my father's estate while my father was still alive. He stole the money. He framed the theft to implicate Moretti. He filed the lawsuit against me to force my hand, knowing that if I fought it, Moretti would surface, and if Moretti surfaced, he'd have the leverage he needed to make federal interference plausible. She looked up. And if I'd just accepted the settlement he offered, he'd have the money, the suppressed evidence, and a signed document in which you withdrew all claims, which could later be used to suggest you'd fabricated the allegations in the first place. Camille sat with this for a long moment. She had thought she understood what Nathan had done. She had thought the forensics had revealed it, the forgery, the shell companies, the stolen inheritance. She had thought she was looking at the complete picture. She had been looking at the frame. "Does Lucy Yen know?" she said. Vera's pause was a half-second too long. Daniel briefed him an hour ago. "Before you told me." Another pause. "Yes." Camille stood up and picked up her coat from the back of the chair. "Where are you going?" Vera said. "To talk to him." "Camille, we should coordinate before—" "I need to talk to him," she said. "Now. Before this gets managed into something I'm only allowed to see from one angle." Vera looked at her for a moment and then nodded slowly and picked up her phone. Lucien was in his building when she arrived. Not the conference room. A different floor, a space that functioned as an actual office rather than a meeting room, with a desk that had real work on it and windows facing east and the harbor visible as a gray stripe in the distance. He was standing when she came in, not sitting, which told her he'd known she was coming and had been waiting rather than working. She came in and stood across the desk from him and looked at him. "You knew before Vera told me," she said. "An hour before." "Yes." "And you didn't call me." "I wanted Vera to control the context," she said. "Structure how I received it. Make sure I had the complete legal framework before the emotional response." He looked at her without flinching. "Yes." "Don't do that again," she said. "I need information straight. I need to be inside the decision-making, not managed around it. If that's a condition you can't meet, tell me now." He studied her for a moment. "All right," he said. "That's a fair condition." "The Dryer connection," she said. "The correspondent bank. Did you know Nathan was trying to build a false link to your operations?" "Not until this morning. I knew he'd been investigating me. I didn't know the investigation had moved into active construction." A pause. "I underestimated him." She noted the absence of qualification in that sentence. No hedge, no deflection, just the flat acknowledgement of an error, delivered with the same tone he'd use to state a fact about the weather. "He's going to approach your federal contacts," she said, "the ones who know about the investigations that were closed. He's going to suggest that pushing my civil case will unravel something larger. He'll have enough of a paper trail to make it plausible." "He already has," Lucian said. She went still. "I received a call this morning from someone inside the U.S. Attorney's Office, someone I've maintained a working relationship with for several years under the understanding that we don't create problems for each other." His voice was very even. "He told me that a federal attorney named Whitmore in the Financial Crimes Division has opened a preliminary inquiry based on materials submitted by an anonymous source. The materials suggest that the civil litigation involving Camille Arden is a vehicle for laundering proceeds from organized crime through a deceased person's estate." He paused. "The materials are convincing. Daniel has already confirmed they incorporate real account data mixed with fabricated transfer records." The room had a particular quality of silence that rooms get when something has shifted inside them permanently. "If the federal inquiry proceeds," Camille said slowly, "the civil case gets stayed. My case against Nathan gets suspended indefinitely pending the federal investigation." "Yes." "And Vera's evidence, the motion to compel, the forensic work, Rosa Gutierrez, All of it becomes secondary to a federal proceeding that Nathan's people are positioned to guide. Yes. And you, she said. A federal inquiry that touches your operations, even a false one, even one that goes nowhere. That's the kind of thing that has consequences for the people around you. Lucien looked at her steadily. Yes. She turned and walked to the window and looked out at the harbor. The gray water, a container ship moving slowly south. The ordinary functioning of a city that had no idea what was happening in this room. She thought about Rosa Gutierrez watching the door, about Marcus Lowe's daughter at soccer practice, about her father in his study reading correspondence she'd never been allowed to see, building a debt in a world she'd known nothing about, trying to make sure she would be protected in the event of something he'd apparently been afraid was coming. Her father had known what Nathan was capable of. She was nearly certain of that now. Had known and had made arrangements and had not told her, possibly because telling her would have required explaining things about his own life that he didn't want her to carry. She loved him, and she was furious with him, and both of those things were useless right now. What does Nathan want? She said to the window. Not legally, not strategically. What does he actually want? Lucien was quiet for a moment. You've been asked to surrender. In stages, deniably, through legal mechanisms. Every time you've refused, the pressure has escalated. The lawsuit was stage 1, the attorney intimidation was stage 2, the press campaign was 3. The gala was... He stopped. The gala was something else, she said. She turned from the window. The gala wasn't surrender pressure. The gala was designed to remove you. Lucien said nothing. If you're gone, Camille said, the legal architecture collapses. Vera's team has no protection. The witnesses reconsider. I go back to being a woman with a box of documents and no lawyer. She looked at him. Nathan doesn't want me to give up. He wants me to be left with nothing to fight with. That's a sophisticated read. I've had 7 years of studying how he thinks, she said. I wasted most of them not believing what I was seeing. I'm done wasting it. She sat down in the chair across the desk because standing was taking more energy than she had to spare. The federal contact, she said. Whitmore. Can you reach him? Not directly, not without making it worse. Then we need to surface the drier evidence fast, before Whitmore's preliminary inquiry gains momentum. If we can get the fabricated transfer records in front of the right journalist or the right congressional oversight contact, it becomes a story about federal process being manipulated rather than a story about organized crime. She paused. But we need Dreyer. We need him on record. Dreyer is not an easy man to put on record, Lucien said carefully. She looked at him. Is he accessible? A pause. He can be made accessible. Legally, she said. I need it to be legally. The pause was slightly longer. There are legal mechanisms that can be applied. Yes. Then apply them. She stood up again. And I need to speak to Daniel today about the congressional angle. Vera's contact in the Oversight Committee, the one she mentioned 2 weeks ago in the context of the document forgery. I want to know how fast we can move. Lucien was watching her with the expression she had first seen in the courthouse conference room, assessing, contained, the look of a man recalibrating. But there was something added to it now, something she couldn't entirely categorize, a quality of attention that went beyond professional assessment. You're different than you were 4 weeks ago, he said. I'm angry, she said, in a way that's useful rather than paralyzing. That's the difference. She left the office and took the elevator down and stood outside on the sidewalk in the cold October air and called Vera and said what she needed, and Vera said she would have Daniel ready at 4. The 4 o'clock meeting was in Vera's conference room and it ran until 7:30. Daniel laid out the congressional angle with the precision she had come to expect from him. Dry, fast, no wasted words. There was a staff director on the House Financial Services Committee named Elaine Cho, who had been quietly gathering materials on private intelligence firms operating in legal gray zones. Meridian Consulting Group was on her radar. The Dreyer connection, combined with the fabricated transfer records, was exactly the category of material her investigation was looking for. How do we get it to her? Camille asked. We don't go to her directly, Daniel said. We go to a journalist who has a relationship with her staff. The journalist publishes what they can verify independently. The rest gets to Cho through channels that don't have our fingerprints on them. How long? If the journalist moves fast and Cho's team is ready to receive, 10 days, maybe 12. Whitmore's inquiry is how far along. Preliminary stage. He needs another 2 to 3 weeks to formalize. We have a window. Camille looked at the timeline on Daniel's laptop screen. 12 days to get the drier evidence into the right hands. 2 to 3 weeks before Whitmore's inquiry locked down the civil case. The margin was real, but it was not comfortable. "Do it," she said. She was outside the building at 7:30, pulling her coat against the cold when her phone rang. Number she didn't recognize. She answered because she was done not answering. "Camille," Nathan's voice. No intermediary, no Pruitt, no professional distance. His voice, direct and unmediated for the first time since before the lawsuit. "I know where you just came from." She said nothing. "I know what Daniel Rice is planning," Nathan said. "I know about Elaine Cho. I know about the journalist he's planning to use." A pause. And something in the pause had the quality of a man placing cards on a table because he wants you to understand the size of his hand. "I have people in places you don't know about." "Then why are you calling me?" she said. "If you have all of that." "Because you can still stop this." His voice dropped. "Camille, listen to me. Not as opposing counsel. As someone who— Don't," she said. "As someone who knows what Moretti's world does to people who get close to it. I've been watching him for 2 years. I know things about him that would— You built a false financial link to frame him for my father's murder," she said. "You hired a sniper to kill him at a charity gala. I don't want to hear what you know about him." Silence on the line, long enough that she thought he'd hung up. "Rosa Gutierrez," Nathan said. The name landed like a door slamming. "She's going to recant," he said. "Tomorrow morning, her attorney will file a declaration stating that her prior statements were made under duress and financial inducement. The declaration has been prepared." Another pause. "I'm telling you this before it happens because I want you to understand that every piece of your case has a version of this. Every witness, every document. I have prepared responses for all of it." The sidewalk was empty. The wind was coming in off the harbor cold and steady, and she stood in it and held the phone and looked at the street. "You're calling me because you're afraid," she said. "I'm calling because I'm offering you a way out. The only way out you've ever offered me is the way where I disappear." She kept her voice very even. "I'm not going to do that." "Camille." She ended the call. She stood on the sidewalk for another moment and then called Vera. "He has someone on Rosa," she said when Vera picked up. "Get to her tonight. Don't wait until morning." "I'll go myself," Vera said immediately. "And whoever his source is inside Daniel's team or yours, we have a leak. He knew about Cho. He knew the journalist connection." A beat of silence on Vera's end that had weight in it. "Understood," Vera said. Camille put the phone in her pocket and stood in the cold and tried to assess the damage. Rosa potentially gone. A leak somewhere in the legal team, which meant Nathan had been receiving real-time information about their strategy for an unknown period of time. The federal inquiry moving. The gala shooting still uninvestigated. Lucienne's position increasingly exposed with every day the inquiry gained traction. She started walking, not toward the subway. She needed to move and think, and she needed the cold air and the specific anonymity of a person walking in a city at night, unremarkable and unidentifiable, and for the moment unlocatable. She thought about what Nathan had said. "I have prepared responses for all of it," said with the confidence of a man who believed he had already won the war and was now simply executing the cleanup. Said she understood because he wanted her to believe it, because making her believe it was a strategy in itself, the same strategy he had spent 7 years executing inside their marriage, the systematic erasure of her belief in her own capacity to win. She was 20 minutes from her apartment, moving through a stretch of street that ran under the elevated rail line, the night overhead broken into squares by the steel framework above her, when she heard footsteps fall into pace behind her. Not running. Matching. The specific, deliberate quality of someone who wanted her to know they were there. She turned. 2 men. Neither of them Lucien's security. She knew his people's faces now, had been unconsciously memorizing them for weeks. These were different men, compact and purposeful in dark jackets, standing 6 feet back on the wet sidewalk under the rail structure, and the way they stood communicated a specific professional language that she understood at the level below language, in the place where the body makes calculations faster than the mind. Her phone was already in her hand. She called Lucian. He picked up in 2 rings. "I need to tell you something," she said. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that, absurdly, in the way you're proud of small technical achievements in the middle of large emergencies. "There are 2 men behind me, under the Ashford Elevated. I've been walking for about 20 minutes from Vera's building." She heard him say something to someone else in the room, short and sharp, and then his voice came back to her with the particular quality of someone doing 2 things simultaneously. "Keep walking. Don't run. Tell me every intersection." She told him. She walked. The men stayed 6 feet back. At the 3rd intersection, she heard the SUV before she saw it, coming from the south, moving fast and then slowing, and the 2 men behind her slowed and then stopped, and she heard them exchange a word she couldn't make out, and when she turned, they were already retreating, moving back under the elevated framework with the brisk purposefulness of people who had just received updated information about the risk calculus. The SUV pulled alongside her. The window came down, and it was the broad-shouldered security man from the gala, and he said, "Ms. Arden," with the inflection of a question, and she got in. She sat in the back seat, and her hands were shaking now that the immediate architecture of the threat had dissolved, the body releasing what it had been holding with a speed that felt almost insulting. All that steadiness, and now this, knees not quite right, breathing too fast. She pressed her palms flat on her thighs. Lucian was already on the phone when they arrived at his building. She sat in the lobby on a low chair and drank water that someone brought without being asked, and listened to fragments of conversation she wasn't meant to hear. The lean, precise planning language of men organizing a response that was not going to be conducted through the courts. When Lucien came to her 20 minutes later, he sat down across from her and looked at her with the directness she had come to rely on. "Rosa is safe," he said. "Vera reached her. She's being moved tonight." "The leak. We found it." His jaw was set. A paralegal in Daniel's office. Young, recent hire, almost certainly placed. A pause. "He's been removed." Camille looked at him. "How much did Nathan's people hear?" "Enough. The Cho strategy is compromised. We need a different route for the drier evidence." She closed her eyes briefly and then opened them and looked at the lobby ceiling and then back at him. "So we're back to the beginning on the federal angle." "Not the beginning. The route changes. The destination doesn't." He looked at her carefully. "Camille, the men tonight, they were a message," she said. "He's telling me he can reach me." "Yes. He's escalating because the drier evidence scares him. He wouldn't be escalating this hard if the evidence wasn't going to destroy him." Lucian was very still. "He's running out of systems to hide behind," she said. "The legal strategy is unraveling. The federal angle requires Whitmore to believe fabricated evidence. The witness intimidation leaves traces. The shooting is a crime that someone will eventually connect." She looked at Lucian. "He's running out of architecture, which means he's going to try something direct." Lucien looked at her for a long moment. "I need you somewhere safer than your apartment," he said. "I'm not disappearing. I'm not asking you to disappear. I'm asking you to be somewhere with security that isn't a 6th-floor studio with a broken bedroom light." His voice was even, but there was something underneath it that was not. "There are rooms in this building. You would retain complete independence. Come and go as you choose. I'm not—" He stopped. "I'm not trying to own the situation." She looked at him. She thought about what Nathan had said on the phone. "I know what Moretti's world does to people who get close to it." And she thought about the 2 men under the elevated framework, and she thought about Rosa watching doors and Marcus Lowe's daughter at soccer practice. She thought about her father making a phone call in a building she'd never visited, setting something in motion that had brought her here, to this lobby, to this man across from her, the chain of choices and consequences spanning years and finally arriving at a moment she had not chosen, but was nevertheless, undeniably, inside. She thought about what Lucian had said 4 weeks ago in the courthouse conference room. "You just have to walk into that courtroom." She had. She kept walking in. She was not going to stop now because Nathan had put men behind her on a dark street. "Separate rooms," she said. "Of course," Lucien said. "I need access to everything. Every piece of evidence, every communication, every decision. I'm not a passenger in this. I know that. And the dryer angle. We need a new route, but we're still moving toward the same destination. I want a plan by tomorrow morning. 7 o'clock, Lucian said. Daniel, Vera, both of us. She nodded and stood up, and the broad-shouldered security man appeared from somewhere to show her to the elevator, and she followed him and stepped in and watched the lobby doors close, and in the narrowing gap she saw Lucien still sitting in the chair with his phone in his hand and his eyes on the floor, the expression of a man looking at something only he could see, running the math on a problem whose variables had recently and significantly shifted. The elevator moved upward. She stood in it and watched the numbers change and held the water glass she'd forgotten she was still carrying and thought about the two men under the railway and Nathan's voice on the phone. I have prepared responses for all of it. And the specific tone of it, the absolute certainty, the sound of a man who did not believe he could lose. She needed Dreyer. She needed him before Whitmore's inquiry locked. She needed him in a form that was clean and legal and couldn't be discredited and couldn't be intimidated and couldn't be recanted. She needed him in the next 8 days or everything Vera had built, everything Daniel had uncovered, everything Rosa had risked, collapsed into the specific kind of legal silence that Nathan had been engineering from the beginning. Not a verdict, not a ruling, just the slow administrative smothering of a case until the woman at the center of it ran out of resources and will, and she didn't sleep until past 3 and was awake again at 5:30, lying on her back in the dark of a room that wasn't hers, staring at a ceiling she couldn't see, running the dryer problem through her mind like a piece of machinery she was trying to reverse engineer by feel alone. The room was on the 14th floor. It had a window facing east and a bathroom with towels that someone had placed with the kind of precise alignment that suggested a person rather than a machine, and a desk with a lamp and a bed that was too good for sleeping in when your mind was doing what her mind was doing. She had her father's photograph on the desk. She'd brought it in her bag without thinking about it, the way you carry certain things without cataloging the decision. At 5:50, she gave up and dressed and went down to the conference room on 11 and sat at the long table with her laptop and the folder of documents she'd carried everywhere for 3 months and started working backward through the dryer file, looking for something she might have missed, or something Daniel might have missed, or something that the previous 48 hours of cascading damage had shaken loose. Dreyer had been paid through his holding company. The holding company had been incorporated in Wyoming 18 months before Meridian was hired by Nathan. Wyoming because Wyoming had disclosure requirements that made Nevada look transparent by comparison. Minimal reporting, maximum privacy, the corporate equivalent of a locked room. But holding companies had banks, and banks, even cooperative ones, had correspondent relationships with institutions that operated under federal reporting requirements. She found the thread at 6:43. Some. It was in the account activity Daniel had pulled, 3 pages in, a line item she had read 4 times before and processed as routine. A wire transfer from Dreyer's holding company to a domestic account 11 months ago. The receiving account number meant nothing to her, but the routing prefix meant something. It was a prefix she recognized from a different document in the pile, a document she had not thought to connect to this one. She pulled both documents and put them side by side and looked at what she was seeing. The receiving account was registered to a family trust. The trust's registered agent was a law firm in Hartford, Connecticut. Her father's estate attorney had used the same law firm. She sat very still. Not the same attorney. Different attorneys at the same firm, which could mean coincidence, which, given everything she now understood about how Nathan operated, meant nothing of the kind. She was still looking at the 2 documents when Lucien came in at 6:55. He was already in a suit, which told her he hadn't slept either, or had slept briefly and efficiently in the way of men who have trained themselves to run on less. He looked at her face and looked at the documents in front of her. "Talk to me," he said. She talked. He listened with the full-body stillness she had come to recognize as his mode of maximum attention, not moving, not interrupting, his eyes on her face. When she finished, he pulled the chair across from her and sat and looked at the 2 pages side by side. "Dreyer paid into a trust managed by your father's estate firm," he said. "A different attorney at the firm, but the same entity. Which means Dreyer had a connection to that firm that predates Nathan's investigation of me. which means Nathan didn't find a connection and exploit it. He found an existing infrastructure and built around it. She pressed her fingers flat on the table. Lucien, what if Nathan and Dreyer knew each other before the investigation? What if Meridian wasn't hired to investigate you? What if Meridian was already in place and Nathan was brought in to provide the legal architecture? Lucien looked at her steadily. That changes the origin point, he said. It changes everything. If Nathan wasn't the architect but the instrument, she stopped. Who hired Dreyer originally? The 7 o'clock meeting lasted 2 hours. Daniel arrived first, then Vera, both of them with the particular tightness of people who had not stopped working since the previous evening. Vera had spent the night managing Rose's relocation. Daniel had spent it tracing the paralegal, a man named Garrett Foss, 26 years old, hired 11 weeks ago on a recommendation from a law school contact whose name, when Daniel ran it, connected back inside 2 steps to a firm that had done work for Nathan's partners. They had been compromised from almost the beginning. Camille put the Hartford firm connection on the table. Daniel went pale in a controlled, professional way, the color change of someone whose internal model of the situation has just been revised at structural depth. The trust, he said, and pulled up his laptop and started moving. Vera looked at Camille. How did you find this? 6 in the morning and nowhere else to be, Camille said. It took Daniel 40 minutes to trace the trust's full ownership structure, moving through 3 layers of corporate registration with the focused speed of someone who had done this before and hated what he was finding. When he stopped typing and turned the laptop to face them, Vera made a sound that was not quite a word. The trust had 3 beneficiaries. One was a holding entity connected to Dreyer. One was a real estate LLC that traced in 4 steps to a man named Vincent Holt, a former federal attorney who had resigned from the DOJ 8 years ago under circumstances that were described in the official record as personal, but which had generated a sealed disciplinary proceeding whose existence Daniel had found referenced in a footnote in a different case file 6 months ago and never had reason to pursue. The third beneficiary was Nathan Vale. Camille looked at the screen, at Nathan's name in a corporate structure that connected him to Dreyer and to a former federal attorney in a trust established 7 years ago, 1 year into her marriage, through a law firm that also represented her father's estate. 7 years. He had been building this for 7 years, before her father's illness, before the divorce, before the lawsuit. The infrastructure had been in place before she had any reason to suspect there was infrastructure. She had been living inside the architecture of her own destruction the entire time, and the structure had been so complete, so patient, so embedded in the ordinary fabric of legal and financial life that she had never seen the edges of it. Vincent Holt, Lucien said. He said it flatly, with no inflection, and something in the flatness made Daniel look at him. You know him, Camille said. He was the lead attorney on the second federal investigation that was closed. A pause. He resigned from DOJ 8 years ago. The personal circumstances were a cover for something that was negotiated rather than disclosed. Another pause. He's been outside government for 8 years. But he kept his contacts, Vera said. He kept everything that mattered. Lucien stood and walked to the window and stood there for a moment with his back to the room. Holt approached me once, 3 years ago, through intermediaries. He suggested a working arrangement, information about federal inquiry timelines in exchange for access to certain financial flows. He turned. I declined. He found someone else, Camille said. He found Nathan. The room absorbed this. What they were looking at was not a divorce case, not a civil lawsuit, not even a scheme to steal a dead man's money, though it was all of those things. What they were looking at was a 7-year construction, a former federal attorney with DOJ contacts, a private intelligence operator, and a corporate attorney with an obsession with control, building a machine designed to insulate itself from consequence by embedding itself so deeply in legitimate legal and financial infrastructure that attacking any part of it looked like attacking the whole system. And somewhere inside that machine was Whitmore's preliminary inquiry, which Holt almost certainly had a line into. Holt is the Dreyer route, Camille said. Everyone looked at her. We don't need Dreyer directly. We need Holt. Holt is the connection between the fabricated transfer records and the federal inquiry. If we can demonstrate that Holt fed information to Whitmore's team, information he manufactured through Meridian, then the inquiry collapses on its own. Whitmore doesn't want to be the face of a corrupted process. Getting Holt on record is harder than Dreyer, Daniel said. I know. But Holt has a sealed disciplinary proceeding. The existence of that proceeding means there are people inside the DOJ who know what he did 8 years ago and chose to bury it rather than prosecute. Those people have exposure now. She looked at Daniel. Who was the supervising attorney on the disciplinary matter? Daniel turned back to his laptop. The answer took 12 minutes to find. The supervising attorney was now a deputy assistant attorney general named Carol Fenwick. She had been in her current role for 3 years. She was, by every account Daniel could find, a person of genuine institutional loyalty and a documented history of recommending prosecution in obstruction cases. She buried it under a different administration, Vera said slowly. Under pressure, she probably didn't fully resist, and she's been living with it for 8 years. People who've been living with something for 8 years, Camille said, are sometimes ready to stop. Lucien turned from the window. This moves fast or it doesn't move. If Holt has a line to Whitmore, Whitmore will know about last night's surveillance on you within 24 hours, if he doesn't already. He'll know the case is destabilizing. He might move the inquiry timeline up. How fast? Camille said. Today, Lucien said. Fenwick today. Dreyer simultaneously if Daniel can find a lever. We file a supplementary motion with Judge Morrow by end of business that references the trust structure and forces Nathan's team to respond in 48 hours. He looked at Vera. Can you do that? I can do it, Vera said, and she was already writing. What followed was a day that moved like surgery, precise, sequential, each action dependent on the one before it, no margin for error, and underneath all of it the constant pressure of a clock that was running against them. Vera drafted the supplementary motion. Daniel worked 3 phones and 2 laptops simultaneously, tracing the Wyoming Trust's banking relationships, building the evidentiary chain that connected Dreyer to Holt to the fabricated transfer records. Lucien made calls from his office that she was not party to, and she didn't ask about them, because she had decided that her condition, tell me everything, had a practical limit when the everything in question involved methods she couldn't fully sanction and genuinely needed to not know. At 2 p.m, Daniel found Fenwick's personal contact information through a law school alumni network. Vera made the call herself, in her office with the door closed, and Camille sat in the conference room and listened to the silence and waited. Vera came out 22 minutes later. She'll meet, Vera said, tonight. She wants it off-site and she wants documentation in advance, and she was very clear that this is an exploratory conversation and not a commitment. She paused. She was also very clear that if the documentation doesn't support what we've told her, she walks, and we never contact her again. The documentation supports it, Camille said. I know. I'm telling you her threshold. Vera looked at her carefully. She wants to meet you, not me. You. Why? Because you're the plaintiff, because you're the one whose father's estate was the vehicle, because she wants to look at the person at the center of this and make the judgment herself. A pause. I think she wants to know it's real, that it's not a legal maneuver. It's real, Camille said. I know that, Vera said. Go make sure she does. The meeting was at 7:30 in a hotel bar in Midtown. Neutral ground, public enough to be safe, private enough for a conversation that neither party wanted overheard. Camille went without Lucien and without security because Fenwick had been explicit about that, and because showing up with protection would signal exactly the wrong thing to a woman who needed to believe she was talking to a victim rather than a faction. She was alone for the first time in nearly 48 hours, and it felt strange and also necessary, like remembering how to hold her own weight after leaning against a wall. Fenwick was already at the bar when she arrived. Mid-50s, silver-haired with reading glasses on a cord, and the bearing of someone who had spent 30 years being the most prepared person in most rooms. She looked at Camille when she sat down with the assessing directness of a former prosecutor, and Camille looked back, and neither of them performed pleasantries. Show me the trust documents, Fenwick said. Camille slid the folder across. Fenwick read. She read the way lawyers read, without expression, without sound, with total absorption. She turned pages at a pace that suggested she was absorbing quickly and looking for contradictions. Camille ordered water and sat with her hands on the bar and let the reading happen. After 12 minutes, Fenwick set the folder down. "You understand what you're asking me to do," she said. "I'm asking you to confirm what you already know about Holt," Camille said. "And if the inquiry Whitmore opened is built on materials that Holt fed through Meridian, I'm asking you to make that known through whatever channel your conscience thinks is appropriate." "My conscience," Fenwick said, with a tone that was not quite ironic. "You buried the disciplinary matter. I understand why. I'm not here to prosecute you for a decision you made 8 years ago under circumstances I wasn't in." Camille kept her voice even. "But you buried it, and he kept operating. And what he built with Nathan Vale in the years since has destroyed a family's estate, intimidated federal witnesses, attempted to frame an organized crime investigation, and resulted in a shooting at a public event." A pause. "I don't know how much of that you need to be responsible for before it stops being something you can live with." Fenwick looked at her steadily. "That's a hard thing to say to someone," Fenwick said. "I know. I'm saying it because I'm done being soft about things to avoid making people uncomfortable." Something shifted in Fenwick's expression. Not offense. Something more complicated. The look of a person hearing a frequency they recognize. "Holt called me 10 days ago," Fenwick said finally. "He didn't say why. He asked about Whitmore's division, who was staffed, what the current caseload looked like. I thought it was networking." She looked at the folder. "I didn't think it was this." "But you're not surprised," Camille said. A long pause. "No." "Then you know what to do." Fenwick looked at her for another moment. Then she picked up the folder and put it in her bag. She left without another word. Camille sat at the bar for a few minutes after she left and drank her water and watched the room in the mirror behind the bottles. Ordinary Thursday night. People with ordinary Thursday night problems. A man laughing too loud at the far end. A couple negotiating something in low voices over untouched drinks. She took out her phone and called Lucian. "Fenwick took the documentation," she said. "She didn't commit, but she took it." "That's enough for tonight," he said. She was halfway to the hotel exit when her phone buzzed with a text from a number she didn't recognize. She stopped walking and opened it. 3 words. "He has Rosa." The cold arrived from the inside out, moving from the center of her chest to the periphery of her hands in the time it took to read it again and confirm that she had read it correctly. She stood in the hotel lobby with the noise of the bar behind her and the city outside the glass doors ahead, and the 3 words on her screen, and made herself breathe through it at a controlled rate and think. She called Vera, straight to voicemail. She called Daniel. He picked up on the 3rd ring. "Camille, I'm in the middle of..." Someone texted me. "He has Rosa. Do you know where she was moved last night?" Silence on the line. Then, "Vera arranged it. I don't have the address. Get me Vera's location." "She's not answering her phone. I've been trying to reach her for the past 20 minutes. The cold deepened. She called Lucian. He answered before the first ring completed. She had never called him and had it ring that fast before, and the fact of it registered somewhere under the urgency. "Someone has Rosa," she said. "Vera's not reachable. I think..." "I know," he said. His voice was the temperature she'd heard once before in the conference room when she'd mentioned Marcus Lowe's daughter, but lower now, more compressed, the cold that came before rather than after. "I've been tracking movement on Nathan's end for the past 3 hours. He moved people this afternoon. I thought it was positioning for tomorrow's filing." A pause. "It wasn't." "Where?" "We're working on that." "Lucien." 20 minutes. Get back here. Now." She went. The SUV was at the curb outside the hotel before she reached the doors, as if it had always been there. As if the city had arranged itself around her trajectory, the way the city always seemed to arrange itself around Lucien's logistics. She got in, and the driver pulled into traffic immediately without being directed, and she sat in the back and looked at the 3 words still on her screen. He has Rosa. Rosa, who had watched doors for 14 months before she found the courage to speak. Rosa, who had said, "I still believe him a little." Rosa, who had looked at Camille across a conference table and understood. The way only people who have been afraid for a long time understand each other, without needing to say the specific things. The building lobby was different when she arrived. 2 additional security men she hadn't seen before, positioning that had been adjusted, a quality of alertness that had moved from professional background hum to active foreground. Lucian was on 11. She took the elevator up and walked in to find him standing at the window with his phone to his ear, and Daniel was there on a laptop, and a man she had never seen before, older, 60s, in a dark jacket, with the particular economy of movement of someone who had spent decades in rooms like this one, was standing near the far wall. Lucian ended his call when she entered. He looked at her with the directness that had never wavered, the thing she had come to trust more than any system or institution or process she had encountered, and he said, "We have a location, an old marina warehouse on the South Docks. Nathan has 4 men there. Vera was taken approximately 90 minutes ago. She drove to check on Rosa's relocation address and walked into something that was waiting for her." Camille absorbed this. "He moved before we filed," she said. "He knew Fenwick met with me tonight." "Holt has surveillance on Fenwick," the man near the wall said. His voice was dry and unhurried. He did not introduce himself, and Lucian did not introduce him. "She was followed from the hotel." "Then Holt already knows what she took from me." "Which means we have until Holt reaches Whitmore tonight before the inquiry gets formalized and everything we're holding becomes evidence in a federal matter we don't control." Lucian put his phone in his pocket. The timeline just moved from days to hours. Camille stood in the center of the room and looked at the faces around her. Daniel's controlled tension, the old man's professional quiet, Lucien's compressed stillness. And she made the calculation that the situation required. "We go get them," she said. "Vera and Rosa, tonight." "Yes," Lucian said. "The filing still happens. Whatever we find at that warehouse, the supplementary motion goes tomorrow by midnight." "Daniel, I can file remotely," Daniel said. "I don't need to be there." "File it. Get it on record before Holt reaches Whitmore." She looked at Lucian. "How many men?" "Enough." "How many is enough?" He looked at her with the expression that preceded precision. 8 plus myself." "Plus me," she said. "Camille, Vera is there because she was doing her job for me. Rosa is there because she was brave enough to tell the truth. I'm not waiting in this building while they're in a warehouse on the South Docks because someone decided I needed to be managed." She held his eyes. "I'm not asking permission. I'm telling you I'm coming." Something moved through Lucian's expression. Not argument. Something more complex and, she thought, more honest. "Stay close to me," he said. "Don't improvise." The vehicles moved south at 9:47. 3 SUVs, no lights, moving through the city's nighttime geography with the calm certainty of people who had planned this route in advance. Rain had started again, not the sheeting rain of earlier in the week, but the cold, fine kind that turned every streetlight into a smear of refracted orange and made the pavement look like something that went down forever. Camille sat in the back of the middle vehicle beside Lucian, and he did not speak, and she did not speak, and the city moved past the windows and she focused on her breathing, the cold and out-of-controlled respiration, and thought about what she knew about Nathan in situations where he believed he had the advantage. He expanded. He became generous with his confidence. He stopped watching the exits. She had watched him do it in courtrooms, in dinner parties, in the small daily theater of their marriage, in the moments when he believed she had accepted his version of events and the crisis had passed. He was waiting in that warehouse believing he had won. Believing the Fenwick meeting had been reported back to Holt, the inquiry was going to be formalized, the filing would be delayed, and Camille Arden was sitting in a building on the financial district somewhere, running out of moves. He did not know about the filing Daniel was executing right now. He did not know about what Fenwick had taken in that folder. And he did not know that Lucien Moretti was 7 minutes away from the South Docks with 8 men and the particular quality of forward momentum that in 7 years of watching him in courtrooms and conference rooms and gala ballrooms, she had never once seen falter. The vehicles slowed. The driver said something low to Lucien in a language she didn't speak. Lucien responded with 2 words and looked at her. "The warehouse," he said. 200 meters. She looked out the window. The docks were dark and wet and industrial, the shapes of cranes and containers against the sky, the harbor beyond them black and moving. the smell of salt and diesel even through the sealed vehicle. "He'll have the exits covered," she said. "Yes." "He'll have a phone if he hears vehicles." "He's heard vehicles," Lucian said. "He's been expecting us." He looked at her with the directness that never wavered, the thing she had come to trust beyond reason. "That's fine. Let him expect us. Expectation makes people watch the doors." A pause. "It stops them from watching the walls." The vehicle stopped. The doors opened into the cold rain. Lucienne stepped out first, and she stepped out after, and the night closed around them both. And ahead through the dark, the shapes of the warehouse resolved against the sky like something that had been waiting a long time for this particular arrival. She walked forward. The rain hit her face and her shoulders, and she did not run. Ahead, from somewhere inside the warehouse, a light went on, and then she heard it. Nathan's voice, amplified, carrying out through the darkness with the precision of a man who had prepared his acoustics. "Lucienne, I was wondering when you'd show up." A pause. "Bring her in. I think it's time we finished this conversation the three of us should have had a long time ago." Lucian did not slow. He walked forward, and she walked beside him, and behind them she could hear the quiet, purposeful movement of 8 men positioning in the dark. And the rain came down steady and cold, and the warehouse door. The warehouse door was steel, and it was open. Not broken open, not forced, open, deliberately, the way you open a door when you want someone to walk through it. A rectangle of yellow-orange light in the darkness of the south docks, and beyond it the shapes of the interior resolving as Camille's eyes adjusted. High corrugated ceiling, concrete floor wet from a leak somewhere above, stacked pallets along the east wall, and in the center of the space under the one functioning industrial light, 2 chairs. Vera was in one of them. She was upright, and her hands were bound behind her, and there was a cut above her left eye that had bled and dried, and her reading glasses were gone. But she was conscious, and she was looking at the door when Camille came through it, and something in her face, the specific relief of a person confirming that the world has not entirely abandoned logic, made Camille's chest constrict in a way she didn't have time for and would not allow herself right now. Rosa was not in the second chair. The second chair was empty, which meant Rosa was somewhere else in the building, or Rosa was somewhere worse, and she couldn't think about that yet. Nathan was standing behind Vera, not holding a weapon. Both hands visible, one holding his phone, the other loose at his side. He was in the same clothes he'd worn to the press conference, as if he'd been wearing the performance this long and hadn't bothered to take it off. In the industrial light of the warehouse, he looked diminished from the courtroom version of himself, the careful tailoring incongruous against the concrete and rust, a man dressed for a television appearance who had arrived somewhere that didn't have cameras. There were 4 men positioned around the perimeter. She clocked them in sequence without making it look like she was clocking them. East wall, south corner, either side of the secondary door on the western end. One of them had a weapon visible. The others suggested weapons rather than displayed them, which was its own kind of language. Lucienne walked in 2 steps ahead of her and stopped and looked at Nathan with the expression that was not an expression. The utter professional blankness that she had come to understand was more dangerous than anger. Nathan looked at him, then looked at Camille. "You came yourself," he said to her. He sounded almost impressed. "I didn't think you would." "Where's Rosa?" Camille said. Nathan glanced toward the secondary door. "She's fine. She's in the back. She's been cooperative." A pause on the word cooperative that she didn't like. "Sit down, Camille." "I'll stand." His jaw tightened. The old reflex, her refusal to comply, his reflex to correct. 7 years of that exchange compressed into a half-second of muscle memory. She watched it move through him, and she watched him suppress it, and she watched him find the composed grief face, the press conference face, the face he used when he needed observers to find him reasonable. There were no observers here. He was still using it. "This has gone further than it needed to," he said. "Everything that's happened, the lawsuit, the hearing, all of it, I want you to understand that none of it was what I wanted. I wanted a settlement. I wanted this to be quiet." "You wanted me to disappear quietly," she said. "Those aren't the same thing." "Camille, you stole my father's money while he was dying." Her voice came out flat and level, and she was glad of it. glad of the absence of tremor, because she meant every word and she needed them to land clean. You forged my signature. You built a financial structure to frame Lucien for something he didn't do. You had a lawyer's daughter photographed at school. You put a sniper in a building above a charity gala. She paused. And tonight you took a woman who spent 14 months being afraid to tell the truth because you made sure she had good reason to be afraid. Another pause. This went exactly as far as you wanted it to go. Don't do the press conference voice at me in a warehouse. Nathan stared at her. Something happened in his face that she had never seen before in 7 years of watching his face. The performance didn't just crack. It fell. Not dramatically, not with the cinematic collapse of a villain finally cornered. It fell the way exhausted things fall, gradually, the weight of maintaining it simply exceeding the structural capacity. What was underneath was less terrifying than she had expected, and more sad. A man in his late 40s standing in a leaking warehouse in a suit he'd worn all day, stripped of every instrument of control he'd spent 3 decades assembling, looking at the woman he'd spent 7 years trying to make small and finding that she was standing in the dark 3 feet away from him, and was not, in any register he could access, small at all. You were supposed to settle, he said, quietly. Not to the room, almost to himself. First offer. Everyone settles at first offer if you structure it right. You were supposed to take the money and go away, she said. I know. It was a fair offer, he said, and there was something so genuinely bewildered in it that she almost felt something she didn't want to feel toward him. It was enough to start over. It was your permission to start over, she said, with your narrative intact and my name attached to your version of what happened. That's not a settlement. That's a leash with a longer chain. Lucien had not moved, had not spoken. He was positioned 6 feet to her left, and she was aware of him the way you're aware of a load-bearing wall. Not something you look at directly, but something whose presence changes the structural math of everything else in the room. The man on the east wall shifted. Lucien's hand moved once, a minimal gesture, almost invisible, and somewhere outside the warehouse something changed in the quality of the silence, not a sound, an absence of sound that had a specific character. The man on the east wall seemed to register it. He looked toward the exterior and then looked at Nathan, and his expression had become the expression of someone doing a rapid and unwelcome reassessment. Your men outside, Lucien said. It was the first thing he'd said since entering. His voice was level. Tell them to stand down. Nathan looked at him. I have 4 people in this building. You had 4 people in this building, Lucien said, and 8 outside, which you believed was an advantage. A pause. We came through the walls. The phrase landed in the room with the weight of something technical and specific. The man on the east wall touched his earpiece and his face went through 3 expressions in 2 seconds. Attention, something incoming, and the very particular blankness of a professional man receiving information that ends his professional calculus for the evening. Nathan looked at the man. The man looked at Nathan. Between them passed the silent communication of a plan dissolving. Tell them, Lucien said again. Same tone, not louder. Nathan made the call. The secondary door on the western end opened. 2 of Lucien's men came through first, and behind them, Rosa Gutierrez, who was upright and mobile and had the look of someone who had been keeping herself very controlled for several hours and was about to stop having to do that. She saw Camille and something in her face broke open briefly and then composed itself. Are you hurt? Camille said to her. No. Rosa's voice was steady. She crossed the floor to stand near Vera's chair. She's okay, she said to Camille about Vera. He needed us intact. For leverage. Lucien's men were cutting Vera's hands free. Vera stood and moved her shoulders carefully, testing the joints, and then she straightened to her full height and looked at Nathan Vale across the warehouse floor with the expression of a woman who had spent 30 years in courtrooms and had a very specific idea of what happened next. Nathan was watching his men stand down one by one, the posture of a man watching an architecture disassemble itself. He was still holding his phone. You can't hold any of us legally responsible for this, he said to Lucien. His voice had found a new register, not the performance, not the bewildered collapse, something that was neither and was in its own way more honest. My attorneys will have me out before morning. The inquiry, Lucien said, is finished. Nathan went still. Carol Fenwick filed a disclosure 40 minutes ago with the DOJ Inspector General. It references Holt's connection to Whitmore's team and the materials submitted through Meridian. He paused. Holt was arrested at his apartment at 9:51 this evening. He declined to be cooperative. Dreyer, when informed of this, decided to be cooperative instead. Another pause. The supplementary motion with Judge Morrow was filed at 9:37, incorporating the Wyoming trust structure and your name as a beneficiary alongside Holt and Dreyer. Morrow will see it on her desk at 7 tomorrow morning. The room had the quality of a space in which something has finished rather than stopped. Nathan's phone was still in his hand. He looked at it as if considering whether to call someone, running the internal inventory of who remained to call, and the inventory was returning empty, and she could see the moment he understood it was returning empty. His hand lowered. "You promised her you wouldn't," he said to Lucien. He nodded toward Camille, and the gesture had the particular quality of a man using her as his last available shield. "You told her." "I told her I was trying very hard not to," Lucien said. "That's not a promise. That's a status report." "Then what?" "You're going to walk out of here," Lucien said, "unharmed, and you're going to retain counsel in the morning, and you're going to spend the rest of whatever freedom you have left navigating the federal exposure that Carol Fenwick's disclosure just created for you, and the civil findings that Vera's team has assembled, and the Judge Morrow motion, and the testimony of Paul Dreyer, who is currently explaining in considerable detail how the Wyoming Trust operated." He paused. "You will not come near Camille again. You will not come near anyone in this room again. You will not approach Rosa Gutierrez or Marcus Lowe or any other witness. You will conduct yourself in the manner of a man who understands that the only reason he is walking to his car tonight, rather than being carried somewhere less comfortable, is because the woman across from you asked me to let the system do its work." He held Nathan's eyes without effort. "Understand that I find the system's pace frustrating. Understand that my patience has a defined limit. And understand that the distance between you and that limit is entirely dependent on your behavior in the coming weeks." Nathan looked at Lucien, then he looked at Camille. She looked back. She thought about what she'd expected to feel in this moment, when Nathan Vale finally ran out of room. She had imagined it, in the long months of the lawsuit and the longer years of the marriage, as something vindicating and clarifying and perhaps luminous. The moment the scales corrected. What she felt was tired. Not the tired of defeat, the tired of duration. The specific exhaustion of a person who has been carrying weight for so long that its removal is not immediately distinguishable from its presence, the body still braced for something that is no longer there. And underneath the tired, something quieter, something she would need more time and more sleep and more distance to fully name. The beginning of a thing, rather than the end of one. Nathan walked out. He walked past her without speaking, and she did not move and did not turn to watch him go, and she listened to his footsteps on the concrete and the sound of the outer door and then the specific quality of silence that meant he was outside, and then gone. Vera was beside her. She put her hand briefly on Camille's shoulder. Not a hug, not a performance of comfort, just contact. The simple acknowledgement of one person who has been through something to another, and then she moved away to talk to Daniel on the phone. Rosa Gutierrez sat down on the edge of a pallet against the east wall and put her head in her hands briefly, not crying, just releasing, the physical gesture of a person finally setting down something that had been too heavy. Camille walked over and sat beside her on the pallet, and they sat together for a while in the warehouse light, not talking. "It's over," Rosa said eventually. "The worst part is," Camille said. Rosa looked at her with the careful eyes. "What does that mean?" "It means tomorrow there are depositions and motions and federal disclosures and probably 6 more months of legal process." She paused. "It means over is a direction rather than a place." Rosa thought about this. "That's not as comforting as you might intend it." "No, but it's true." Rosa made a sound that was almost a laugh. It was small and tired and genuine, and it moved through the warehouse and dissolved into the ordinary dark. The drive back was quiet. Vera and Rosa were in the second vehicle. Camille sat in the back of the first with Lucien, and the city moved past, and neither of them spoke for several blocks. and the not speaking had a different quality than before, less the silence of two people managing a professional relationship, and more the silence of two people who have been through the same night and are still processing whether they came out of it as the same people they went in. "Fenwick," she said eventually. "She moved faster than I expected," Lucienne said. "She's been waiting 8 years for a reason to move fast." "Yes." A pause. "You gave her the reason." "The documents gave her the reason." "You put the documents in front of her and told her the truth about what they meant and what it cost you to be sitting at that bar." He looked out the window. "The documents were necessary. You were sufficient." She sat with that for a moment. "Dreyer," she said. "He'll cooperate fully. He understands his position." "And Holt?" "Holt will fight. He has the resources and the contacts and the institutional knowledge to mount a significant defense." A pause. "He will not win, but it will take time and it will be ugly and it will require you to testify in a federal proceeding that will be public and uncomfortable." He turned and looked at her. "I want you to know that before you hear it from someone else. This isn't clean. The next several months aren't clean." "I know," she said. "I'm not looking for clean, I'm looking for true." They rode in silence for another block. "Your father," Lucian said. Not a question. A statement, offered carefully, the way you offer something breakable. "What about him?" "He knew more than he told you. I've been thinking about how to tell you that, and I don't have a way that isn't just the plain fact." A pause. "The firm in Hartford, the one with the trust connection. Your father used that firm for 15 years. He knew Holt peripherally, from his years doing civic work that intersected with the DOJ's community initiatives. When Nathan entered your life, your father ran a background on him, privately. He found edges, things that didn't resolve the way they should. And he made contact with the Hartford firm to quietly structure protections around the estate against the contingency that Nathan turned out to be what those edges suggested." She processed this. "He thought Nathan was dangerous before I married him," she said. "He thought Nathan was a risk. He was not certain." Lucian's voice was careful. "He chose not to tell you because you were in love and he couldn't prove anything. And he thought, he told me this himself when he came to see me, that telling you would have read as a father who couldn't let his daughter make her own choices." A pause. "He said he would rather be wrong and silent than right and controlling." The city moved past. "He was right and silent," she said. "Yes. And he spent the years after trying to build enough protection around the edges that when it came apart, when the thing he was afraid of turned out to be real, you would be there." "Yes." She looked out the window. A bakery with its lights on, preparing for the morning, the early municipal trucks beginning their rounds, the city's overnight machinery running quiet and steady. Her father had sat in his study reading other people's manuscripts and had known the whole time, and had loved her by protecting her invisibly rather than by warning her, and she could spend the rest of her life deciding whether she forgave him for that, or she could choose to understand it as the specific kind of love that looks like silence and works in the spaces she never thought to look. She chose understanding, not because it was easier, because it was what he'd tried to give her. "He would still have hated the cars," she said. Lucian made the sound that in a different person would have been a laugh. In him it was something more contained, a brief relaxation of the jaw, a single exhalation, the closest he came. "He would have tolerated them," he said. "He was practical when it mattered." "He really did talk to you." "Several times over the years, mostly about books." A pause. "He once told me the problem with powerful men is they read too many books about other powerful men. He recommended I read more women." He paused again. "I did." She sat with that image, her father in this man's office, drinking bad coffee probably, talking about books. And it was so completely and precisely her father that she had to look out the window for a moment until the feeling passed. The building appeared ahead. Lucian's security detail moved to the curb. The door opened. The night air came in cold and clean, washed out after the warehouse. The smell of rain and asphalt instead of diesel and rust. She got out. She stood on the sidewalk and looked up at the building, and then turned and looked at Lucian, who had gotten out on the other side and was looking at her across the roof of the vehicle. "Thank you," she said. He nodded once. It was not a dismissal. It was an acknowledgement between people who have agreed that certain things don't require more words than they require. She went inside. She slept. For the first time in as long as she could locate in memory, she slept without the procedural dreams, without the inventory of documents and motions and legal timelines running through the dark. She slept the way you sleep when something that has been coiled in you for years has finally, at considerable cost, let go. She woke at 7:30 to gray light through the east window and her father's photograph on the desk and the sound of the city beginning its ordinary day. She showered, she dressed. She went down to the conference room on 11 and found coffee already made. She never knew who made it. It was always there. Another small thing that had simply been arranged. And she drank it standing at the window facing the harbor. At 8:15, Vera arrived with Daniel. They worked for 3 hours on the Judge Morrow response, the supplementary declarations, the framework for presenting the trust evidence in the context of the civil case. Rosa had given a fresh deposition by phone at 7. Fenwick's disclosure was already generating internal DOJ movement. Daniel had a contact who reported the Inspector General's office had opened a formal inquiry into Holt and Whitmore's division before 9 a.m. Pruitt called Vera at 11. He requested an off-the-record conversation. Vera granted him 45 minutes and called Camille afterward. "He's going to advise Nathan to pursue a consent judgment," Vera said. "Full financial restitution, admission of the forgery for purposes of the civil record, dissolution of the shell companies, transfer of the publishing company shares to your name." A pause. "He won't recommend Nathan admit criminal liability. That's for the federal matter, which Pruitt isn't handling. But for the civil case, Pruitt is telling him to stop." "Nathan will listen to him," Camille said. "Nathan doesn't have another option that doesn't end with him in a federal deposition explaining the Wyoming trust to Carol Fenwick's people." Another pause. "He'll sign." He signed. Not that day. 3 weeks later, after the formal negotiation that Vera conducted with the flat efficiency of a woman who had not slept well for a month and was disinclined to be patient with delay, Nathan came to the table without Pruitt in the end. Pruitt had withdrawn on the grounds of a conflict, and with a new attorney who was younger and quieter and did not have the aggrieved bearing of someone who expected proceedings to go his way. Nathan himself did not attend. The signatures arrived by messenger. Camille was in Vera's office when the documents came through. She sat at the table and Vera put the pages in front of her and she read every line because she had learned to read every line, and then she signed her name at the bottom, her own name, the one she had been born with, not the one she had spent 7 years attached to. The pen went down. Vera said something professionally affirming that Camille didn't fully hear. She nodded and folded her copy of the documents and put them in the folder she still carried everywhere out of habit, and she went outside. The day was cold and clear. November now, the city sharpened by the first real freeze of the season, everything clarified and hard-edged and bright. She stood on the sidewalk outside Vera's building and breathed in the cold air and let herself feel, with deliberate attention, the specific weight of what had just changed. Her father's company came back to her. The shares. The name on the door, Arden House. The small publishing concern her father had built from a rented office and a $20,000 loan, and 30 years of genuine love for manuscripts that deserved more readers than they had found. It was not a large company. It had never been large. It published serious books for serious readers and kept its overhead small and its editorial conscience intact, and her father had run it as a kind of extended act of faith in human attention, and Nathan had moved it into a shell company the way you move furniture into storage, without sentiment, without understanding that he was not moving furniture. She was going to get it back. Not just the legal entity. The actual thing. She was going to open the office in Hartford and sit in her father's chair and read the manuscripts that had been sitting in submission queues for the 2 years the company had been in administrative limbo. And she was going to call the authors who had trusted Arden House with their work and tell them she was back. And she was going to build the foundation, the one she'd been planning in the abstract for months, the the thing that used the company's platform and her own hard-won knowledge of what coercive control looked like from the inside to put resources in front of women who were where she had been, who were reading the signs and not yet believing themselves, who needed the specific kind of help that didn't require a bruise to be real. She had the shape of it clearly. She had the contacts she'd been quietly building through her volunteer work. She had Rosa, who had called her 2 days after the warehouse and said, with the direct simplicity of someone who had decided to stop being afraid of her own direction, "I want to help build it. Whatever it is, tell me what you need." She was going to need a lot. She was ready for that. The black car pulled up at the curb at noon. She had known it would. Lucien had said he wanted to speak after the signing, and he had the quality of a man who showed up when he said he would, which she had come to understand was rarer than it should have been. He got out. Dark coat, the cold not appearing to bother him, standing on the sidewalk with his hands in his pockets and looking at her with the same directness it had always been. "Done," she said. "Yes." "Holt's deposition is next week." "Yes, you won't need to attend. Fenwick's team has enough without your testimony for the preliminary proceeding." She nodded. They stood on the sidewalk in the November cold, and she looked at him and thought about all the things she knew about him now. The full architecture of his world, the methods she had chosen not to ask about directly, the darkness that was genuinely there and was not performed and was not going to change because he had spent 3 months standing between her and Nathan Vale. She thought about what Nathan had said in the warehouse corridor at the gala. His world does to people who don't belong in it. She thought about whether she belonged in it or whether belonging was even the right frame, whether two people could occupy adjacent worlds without one absorbing the other. She thought about this question that every version of this kind of thing eventually produced. The question of what it was, what to call it, where it went from here. And she thought about how that question was not the one she needed to answer today. Today she had signed documents and gotten a company back, and she was standing on a sidewalk in November with her coat against the cold, and for the first time in years she could feel the actual ground under her feet, solid and real and precisely where she was standing. "I'm going to Hartford next week," she said, "to open the office." "I know. I'm not asking permission." The corner of his mouth moved. "I know that too." She looked at him. "Are you going to tell me to be careful?" "No, you know to be careful." A pause. "I was going to ask if you needed someone to drive you." She considered this. "1 car," she said. "Not 3. 1 car. And you don't come in unless I invite you." He looked at her with the expression she had first seen in the courthouse conference room and had been trying to accurately name ever since. The assessment that had somewhere along the way become something else, something that had no professional category, that existed outside the architecture of debt and protection and legal strategy in a register she was only beginning to know how to read. "That's a reasonable condition," he said. "I have a lot of reasonable conditions," she said. "I've noticed." She looked at him for another moment, and then she looked at the street, the ordinary November street with its ordinary traffic and its ordinary people going about the business of their ordinary lives, and she thought about her father making a phone call in a building she'd never visited. And she thought about Rosa watching doors, and she thought about a woman standing outside a courthouse in freezing rain with no lawyer and a folder of documents and the specific compound of fear and stubbornness that had somehow held together long enough to get her here. Here was not perfect. Here had costs that were still being tallied. Here had a man beside her whose world she would never fully inhabit and whose darkness she could not and would not ask him to discard, because she had learned the difference between demanding someone be simple and accepting someone as real. But here was hers. Not given to her, not arranged for her, built by her out of everything Nathan had tried to reduce her to, from the pieces that he hadn't managed to take, from the stubborn, unreasonable, surviving fact of herself. She turned back to Lucien. 1 car, she said. Thursday. Thursday, he said. She walked, not toward his car, not toward Vera's building. She walked in the direction of the subway because she needed to go back to the studio apartment and pack the boxes of her father's books, and she needed to buy a train ticket to Hartford for the following week, and she needed to call Rosa and tell her the documents were signed, and she needed to eat something because it was noon and she had forgotten breakfast again. She was halfway down the block when she stopped. She turned back, Lucienne was still standing at the curb, watching her go, not managing her departure, not calling after her, just watching, the way you watch something you want to make sure is real. He recommended I read more women, she said. My father, when he told you that. Yes. The first thing I'm going to do when I open the office is pull the submission queue, she said. There are probably 2 years of manuscripts in there, a lot of them from women. She paused. You could read some of them if you wanted to know what he meant. Something shifted in his face. Real, this time. Not the compressed professional control, not the temperature changes she'd learned to read as emotional weather. Something open, briefly, the way a room looks when someone has just unlocked it. I'd like that, he said. She turned back toward the subway. The city moved around her in its ordinary way. The ordinary noise and cold and motion of November. The street vendors and the pigeons and the delivery trucks and the people with their phones and their coffees and their entirely reasonable preoccupation with the particular weight of their own lives. She walked through it, not faster than it, not separate from it, through it, belonging to it, her shoes on the pavement and her breath making small clouds in the cold air, and her father's folder of documents under her arm, and every door ahead of her unknown, and for the first time in 7 years that fact felt like something other than a threat. She went down the subway steps and through the turnstile and onto the platform and stood while the train came in from the dark tunnel with its rush of displaced air and its lights bright against the underground. She got on. The doors closed behind her. She was already thinking about Hartford.